Hey guys, I'm Sig. Over the past few months, there's been a lot of new people trying to solo Palace of the Dead, and with patch 5.3, even the free trial now allows new players to go all the way to floor 200. There's some good resources out there, but as of yet, there's no video guide focused on soloing. I've created this guide to fill that gap, both to help out those who are already going for their first solo clear, but also to hopefully convince some of those who have never considered it to give it a try. This guide will be focused on clearing Palace solo as a red mage, but there will be a lot of info that can still be applied if using a different job. This video can also be helpful if you're planning on clearing Palace with a group, although that certainly isn't the main focus. I'll be assuming that you at least have a basic knowledge of how Palace of the Dead works, so if you're completely new to it, I'd suggest trying out at least a few sets of floors for yourself and learning the basics before continuing this video. This will be an extremely long video, so I've split it up into much smaller sections. Timestamps are in the description, so feel free to jump around to the sections that interest you most. I'll start off by answering some of the questions I see the most about soloing Palace. The first and most obvious question is, why would you want to run Palace solo in the first place? The benefit that initially attracts many people is the title you receive for completing floors 1 through 200 solo without failing the duty, the Necromancer. Even after several years of being available, it's still one of the rarest titles. At the time of this video, there's roughly 200 or less characters on the NA data centers that have it. Because of this, the Necromancer is one of the most highly coveted titles in the game. However, a number of players that obtain the title still continue to run Palace solo, so there must be other reasons to do it. One of these reasons is the official leaderboard for Palace. Whenever you complete a run, you'll be given a score based on various factors. If your score is in the top 25 of your data center for the job, you'll be added to the official leaderboard. The competition this creates between players, and the recognition that comes with having your name on the official leaderboard, motivates many runners to try to improve on their own scores and attempt the challenge with different jobs. But at the end of the day, the biggest reason why people run Palace solo is that they find it fun. It's very challenging. The low number of clears is certainly a testament to that. Like other high difficulty content in the game, soloing Palace gives that feeling of being able to see yourself improve and progress, but at the same time, it doesn't require you to rely on 7 other people. Additionally, Palace can feel very different from other content because RNG plays an extremely significant factor. It determines floor layouts, enemy spawns, the Pomanders that you receive, mimics, traps, and more. Because of this, every single run is different. You're always approached with new challenges to overcome, and there's no perfect formula or set of strats that you can always follow. Instead, you need to be able to apply your past experience to make the best decisions on how to handle each unique run, and because every run is different, each one presents an opportunity to learn and improve your decision making for the future. This variety keeps Palace from becoming stale, and is one of the biggest reasons why many runners can maintain interest for such a long time. Finally, the last reason why many people solo Palace is the community. The solo deep dungeon community isn't particularly big, but it's still filled with a lot of very talented people who know the content inside and out and love it to death. Everyone, even the very best, is always happy to answer questions and help newcomers. Soloing Palace is fun, but knowing that you have an amazing community alongside you makes it even better. The next question you might have about Palace is, how hard is it to clear all 200 floors solo? Do you need to be an extremely good player to do it? What skills and knowledge do you need to clear? First of all, you do need to have a good understanding of the tools available to your job at level 60. Having heavily optimized rotations and complete knowledge of the job isn't necessary, at least for Red Mage, but definitely can be helpful. I'll be giving some tips in this guide on how playing Red Mage solo in Palace differs from other content in the game, but I won't be giving a full overview on how the job should be played in general. There are other resources out there that can teach you that much better than I can. Instead, this guide primarily focuses on building your Palace-specific knowledge, including but not limited to knowing which enemies to fight and when you should fight them, when and how to use Pomanders effectively, and how to handle all the bosses. Building this knowledge is absolutely essential towards achieving a clear. However, while this guide should provide you with a lot of information on all of these topics, the massive role that RNG plays in Palace means that there's very few specific formulas and strategies that can be applied to every run. Because of the infinite number of scenarios that you can be presented with, the knowledge you get from this guide will need to be paired with additional experience before you're able to clear. This is where the true difficulty of Palace begins to show. Being able to use your experience to determine the best choice for a situation without having seen it before. As far as building this experience, practicing and doing runs yourself is ideal, but a full run from floor 1 to 200 can take upwards of 15 hours. Failing somewhere along the way prevents you from progressing past floor 100 for that attempt, so you'll need to start over each time. If you're having trouble and keep failing on one of the later sets of floors, every new attempt will require a lot of hours just to make it back to that set, even if you start from floor 51. Because of this, I found that the most effective use of my time was to watch multiple videos of more experienced players clearing the same set before attempting it myself. Those hours of studying before every tough set ended up saving me a lot of additional time and attempts, so I would suggest that you do the same. Finally, to give some context on the difficulty from my own experience, I started playing Final Fantasy XIV as my first MMORPG in December 2019, started learning Red Mage and soloing Palace 2 months later, and got my clear 3 months after that in May, after around 20 to 25 attempts and a lot of studying. Hopefully this guide makes it easier for you than it was for me, especially if you have more than a few months of FF14 under your belt. At the end of the day, I think a lot of players have what it takes to clear, but it absolutely requires a lot of time and practice. Why does this guide focus on Red Mage? Is it particularly good at clearing Palace compared to other jobs? There are 2 major goals to balance when running Palace: being able to clear floors at a speed fast enough to finish each set within an hour, and being able to stay alive at the same time. For a long time, Red Mage was the only job that was able to achieve both of these goals and get the clear. However, over the past year or so, there's been a lot of runners finding success with other jobs, to the point where every job now has at least 1 clear. Red Mage still has some benefits that make it one of the better choices when trying to clear solo, but if you have more fun playing other jobs, know that they're all doable. Some might just be a lot tougher than others. If looking for other suggestions, especially if you're using the free trial and don't have access to Red Mage, I'm probably not the best person to answer, but Machinist in particular has seen an explosion in the number of clears over the past year, to the point where it now has significantly more clears than Red Mage. There are also some people who like to use the tanks for the additional comfort they provide when fighting some of the harder hitting enemies. The biggest advantage of Red Mage is that it's the only job that combines a high damage output with the ability to produce a sustained significant amount of healing. High damage output is extremely important on the later floors because running out of time becomes a big concern. Jobs with lower damage output, such as tanks and especially healers, might be able to keep themselves alive through more punishment, but can be more reliant on good Pomander usage and RNG to clear floors at an efficient pace and finish the later sets within an hour. Red Mage does enough damage to where clearing these sets in time, while still tough, is very doable even without the best RNG or POM usage. As for survival, Red Mage has enough tools to keep it alive throughout the late floors between Vercure and being able to partially kite because of dual cast. In particular, Vercure makes the floor 180 boss very straightforward for Red Mage, whereas most other jobs struggle heavily with it because the final phase with Meteors functions as an enrage for jobs that don't have sustained healing, but Red Mage is able to survive them indefinitely and take its time during this phase of the fight. There are drawbacks to Red Mage though, which is why some other jobs have started seeing just as much success as it. Many of the strategies that other jobs use to mitigate damage are either unavailable or limited in their effectiveness as a Red Mage. It doesn't have damage mitigation abilities, it's unable to spin enemies while doing substantial damage, and it can't fully kite because it has to stop for every other cast. Because of this, there's a number of enemies on the late floors that Red Mage can only take on with the help of buffs from Pomanders, and a smaller subset of enemies that it should avoid altogether. As for why I chose to focus on Red Mage for this guide, the answer is simple. It's the only job I've cleared Palace with, and the only job that I feel comfortable playing and using as an example for others. Should you start by soloing Palace of the Dead, or Heaven on High first? The answer is either. I personally started and cleared Palace first, and still have yet to start attempts on Heaven on High. Regardless of which one you choose to start with, a significant amount of the knowledge and experience you gain from it can often be applied to the other one. However, there are a few differences that can make one more appealing than the other to those looking to solo their first deep dungeon. In terms of which one's more difficult, the answer really depends on who you ask. The non-boss enemies in Palace hurt much less on the later floors than those in Heaven on High. Mimics especially are much more forgiving in Palace. On the other hand, the bosses in Palace tend to be tougher. As mentioned before, if using a job that doesn't have access to significant sustained healing, the floor 180 boss in Palace can be extremely tough because the final phase functions as an enrage. For Red Mage, Vercure means that this boss isn't as tough as it is for other jobs, but the other late floor bosses in Palace are also generally tougher than their Heaven on High equivalents. Possibly the best argument for starting with Heaven on High is that it's only 100 floors instead of 200, meaning that each attempt takes much less time, and it's faster to return and practice whichever floors are causing you trouble. Heaven on High also gives each job access to its level 70 kit, compared to only level 60 in Palace, which can make some jobs much more interesting to play. It's worth noting that because of this, you need to be at least level 61 with the job you wish to use to enter Heaven on High. For Palace, you can be any level, though you'll want to at least have your job stone so that you'll unlock all the actions available to your job. Finally, Heaven on High has had significantly more clears in total, and a much better distribution of clears across jobs that aren't named Machinist or Red Mage, meaning that it's generally thought to be the more well-balanced deep dungeon for soloing, especially for the many jobs which only have a small handful of clears in Palace. Despite these reasons for starting with Heaven on High first, there's nothing wrong with doing Palace first instead. After all, that's what I personally did, and maybe the existence of this guide will sway you towards trying Palace first as well. What do you need to clear Palace? There are two absolute essentials. First, the Aetherpool Armor that determines your item level within the dungeon will need to be capped out at plus 99 for you to have a chance at the highest floors. These upgrades are given randomly in silver chests, and higher floors provide a higher chance for Aetherpool upgrades. You don't have to be at plus 99 when starting an attempt. You can begin with less as long as you pick up enough upgrades along the way to be capped out once you reach the later floors. The second essential item for clearing Palace is Sustaining Potions. You will not be able to clear without these. They provide healing over time for 15 seconds, and because they're also on a 15-second cooldown, you can use another one as soon as the effect ends. When fighting enemies on the later floors, they're an absolutely essential tool. Without them, you'll take too much damage to survive. On a full run to floor 200, I use around 500 of these potions, so you'll want to make sure to have a lot available. They can be purchased from Iuna Kotor just outside the dungeon using Gelmoran potsherds. One potsherd will get you 20 sustaining potions. Potsherds can be found as a random drop from bronze chests, and you'll also get one for free each time you clear floors 50 and 100. They drop in bronze chests at a much higher rate after floor 100, so if you're having trouble finding them, try and make it to these floors. Unfortunately, you probably won't find enough during each run to match the amount that you need to use at the higher floors, meaning that there will probably be times where you have to do runs specifically for the purpose of farming potsherds instead of trying to progress and clear. There's also a few other items that are extremely helpful and I would recommend using, but I wouldn't say are technically necessary. The first is max or super potions. Max potions drop at a high rate in Palace, so you'll almost certainly end up with an absurd number of these sitting in your inventory. Similarly, super potions drop at a high rate in Heaven on High, and they do provide slightly more healing at max Aetherpool level for Red Mage, but only by a small amount. If you have some super potions from doing Heaven on High, go ahead and use them, but max potions are perfectly fine if that's all you have. These potions are great for emergency situations where even a small bit of extra health can save you, and are also useful when fighting high damage enemies to save yourself from having to use a Vercure. The other item I would absolutely recommend using is food. The most important aspect is the extra vitality that it gives you. Having that extra HP will save you over and over again on the later floors. The other substats don't matter quite as much. Try to use at least item level 415 food with a 10% vitality boost to get the maximum increase in HP. Where can you find other resources to help you get the clear? Maygi's guide is considered the gold standard for information regarding Palace. It provides a lot of the same information from this video in a text format, so if you prefer to read or need a handy reference available while doing attempts, I definitely recommend checking it out. I put the link in the description. There's also a number of Twitch streamers which focus on Deep Dungeon as their primary content, and they're always happy to answer any questions you might have to help you get the clear. The one that I've watched the most and got me into soloing Palace is AngelusDemonus. He has VODs on YouTube of his Palace clears using Red Mage. I watch each of them a number of times while trying to get my own clear, so I suggest checking them out. In fact, a little over a year ago, he did a full 200 floor tutorial clear stream as Red Mage. The link to this is also in the description. As you solo Palace, if you have any questions at all, or just want to talk to someone about your adventures and progress, feel free to reach out to me and I'll be happy to talk. You can also check me out on Twitch, where I'll be streaming plenty of my own palace attempts. I'll be uploading some of these streams to YouTube in the near future, so even if you aren't able to catch it live, there should still be plenty of footage on this channel to help out if you're having trouble or need something to study. The rest of this guide is split up into 2 sections. The first section will contain general information that'll help throughout the entire dungeon. It'll provide information on how the dungeon mechanics work, the different types of enemies that can be encountered, how to maximize value from Pomanders, how to deal with traps and enchantments, and more. The second section will be a floor-by-floor guide that covers floors 140 to 200, which tend to be the floors that people have the most trouble on. As I mentioned before, clearing Palace of the Dead solo requires that you achieve 2 goals. The first is to clear floors fast enough to finish the duty within an hour, meaning that it's important to make decisions that save you as much time as possible. The second is to stay alive, meaning that it's important to reduce mistakes and bad decisions that cost you your life. For a majority of floors, even solo, meeting these 2 goals isn't particularly difficult with a small amount of preparation. But once you start reaching the later floors, accomplishing both at the same time becomes a very tough challenge, especially because decisions that'll save you time are often dangerous for your survival, and vice versa. In this section of the guide, I'll be going over general mechanics that you'll encounter throughout all 200 floors of Palace, and how they can all be best handled to accomplish both goals, specifically on the tough late floors where you need every advantage that you can get. I'll first start by covering the absolute basics and general survival tactics. At the start of each floor, with the exception of your spawn room, each room will begin with a number of enemies. Over time, additional enemies will spawn. These additional enemies can spawn in any room, including your starting room, so it's important to always be aware of your surroundings, as an area that was safe before might not be empty for long. As you move through Palace, the number of enemies that spawn initially in each room tends to increase, while the rate at which additional enemies spawn decreases. Once you reach the later floors, you can generally expect each room to start with 2 to 4 enemies, and for an additional enemy to spawn every 5 minutes. To proceed to the next floor, you need to kill a number of enemies to activate the Cairn of Passage. This number can vary highly, and tends to increase slowly as you move throughout Palace. It's usually anywhere between 4 to 10 kills for the later floors. The only indicator you're given to see your progress towards unlocking the exit is this key located above your minimap. As you get kills, it'll turn dull shades of blue, then orange, then yellow and gold, and finally bright light blue once the exit is open. However, this indicator can be very unreliable. Sometimes a kill won't even change the color of the key, while other times it'll skip through half of the different possible shades all at once. You can use it as a general guideline of your progress, but be aware that it shouldn't be trusted as a precise indicator. On early floors, fighting multiple enemies at once can be a good strategy for efficiently clearing sets. However, on later floors, fighting groups of enemies becomes a death sentence. Focus on engaging only one target at a time. If placed in a situation where you have to fight multiple, you can use Pomanders to help deal with them. I'll discuss this more when we cover Pomanders later in the guide. Because fighting even a single enemy can become tough towards the back end of Palace, there's a few strategies that you'll need to learn to use to survive. The first has already been discussed before, sustaining potions. These provide a significant amount of healing over time for 15 seconds, and can be used again as soon as the effect drops. For many enemies on later floors, especially bosses, you'll almost always want to have the effects of a sustaining pot up and running while you're fighting them, so be sure to bind it to a key that's easily accessible, because you'll be using it often. The best way that a red mage can reduce the overall amount of damage taken is to kite enemies. To kite an enemy, simply run away from it whenever you aren't casting. While you do have to stop for every other cast, dual cast allows you to stay on the move at least half of the time, which can significantly reduce the amount of damage you take from autos. When kiting, always be aware of your surroundings. One strategy that I use when kiting enemies is to usually look in the direction that I'm moving, rather than back at the enemy, to ensure that I don't run straight into even more danger. You can even take kiting one step further by using a stop-and-go pattern of movement. It takes quite a bit of practice to get the timing correct, but the steps are as follows. Move away from a mob, stop moving, wait for the mob to run over, then move again as soon as the mob approaches and starts to slow down. If you execute it correctly, you can avoid getting auto-attack completely and repeat the cycle again. Unfortunately, the timing of the stop and go doesn't quite match up with the amount of time needed to cast a spell, so you won't be able to do it continuously while outputting damage, but it is useful for avoiding an attack or two every once in a while. Cure is the single biggest advantage that Red Mage has over most other jobs in Palace. Being able to heal yourself significantly is extremely important for situations where you take an unexpected amount of damage, such as setting off a landmine trap or taking a few crits from an enemy. However, there's plenty of times on the late floors against stronger enemies where it'll be needed to help deal with expected sources of damage as well, both from normal mobs as well as bosses. Like sustaining pots, there'll be a lot of situations where Cure is needed on the later floors, so get accustomed to using it. Another important tactic for staying alive is to move along the edges of rooms. This reduces the chances of activating a trap. Especially on later floors, setting off a trap is one of the fastest and most common ways to end a run. Because of this, you should always be moving along the edge of rooms unless you know that it's safe. There are scenarios where traps will appear along the edges, but they're much rarer than traps that appear centrally, and for the last 50 floors, you can actually memorize exactly which rooms could possibly have a trap along the edge so that you never hit one unexpectedly. We'll go over the different types of traps and these specific rooms in more detail later in the guide. Pomanders are the last and some of the most important tools in your arsenal for staying alive on later floors. Because of their importance, there's an entire section in this guide dedicated to using them effectively. If you have a lot of experience playing Red Mage outside of soloing Palace, there's a few additional things that differ in combat that you should keep in mind as well. Contra Sixt is probably the only attack that you'll be using on the later floors of Palace that is able to hit multiple enemies. Always be very careful when using it, you don't want to accidentally aggro an additional nearby mob. While the burst damage from the melee combo is hard to ignore, it can eventually become pretty tough to find opportunities to use it when fighting enemies on the very late floors. Using a melee combo prevents you from being able to kite and avoid auto attacks for a period of time, which can be extremely dangerous against the hardest hitting mobs. In short, just remember that you shouldn't always look to use the combo as soon as it's available. Instead, it's good to wait for safe opportunities to use it, such as when enemies are stuck casting. Always think about the trajectory of your movement before using Core or Displacement. It's extremely easy to accidentally aggro an enemy or set off a trap if using them across a room, so I almost always limit my usage of them to areas between rooms and edges. Lucid Dreaming is useful against late floor bosses. This is because Cure uses a pretty significant amount of MP, and you'll likely be healing yourself fairly often during these fights, especially if you aren't doing a good job of keeping your sustaining pot up and running. In particular, it's extremely important to remember to use it for the floor 180 boss fight, where you'll be using Cure constantly throughout the final phase. As for Swift Casts, I personally mostly keep it available to use for emergency Cures rather than offensive spells, in case I hit an unfortunate landmine, or take more damage from something than expected. That's more personal preference than an absolute rule, but I do suggest keeping it available if you feel prone to making mistakes. There are 3 different types of chests. The first and most important are gold chests, which contain Pomanders. The second type are silver chests, which can upgrade your Aetherpool arm and armor. The higher the floor, the greater the likelihood of getting an upgrade, so if you're having trouble getting to plus 99, keep climbing higher and opening them. These chests also have a chance to explode and deal damage equal to 70% of your total HP, so be sure not to open one if your health isn't topped off, because it can kill you. If your Aetherpool level is fully upgraded, then there's mostly no reason to open these chests unless you're trying to increase your score. However, there are scenarios where you can use an exploding silver chest to your advantage, because it also deals damage to nearby enemies. If you're able to set up an enemy so that it's casting next to a silver chest, you can open it and get a quick kill if it explodes. You can also open it next to an enemy that isn't aggroed, Cure yourself, and then finish off the enemy. Again, in both of these situations, only do it if you're at or near full HP. The third type are bronze chests, which can contain max potions, phoenix downs, and most importantly, Gelmoran potsherds, which can be used to buy sustaining pots. The likelihood of a bronze chest containing a potsherd seems to be much higher past floor 100, so always be sure to get past that point if you're farming for them. Mimics can randomly spawn from chests. All mimics have the same attack pattern. They'll hit you with auto attacks, cast a spell called Infatuation, and use a circular AoE called Death Trap. Infatuation will inflict you with Accursed Pox, a 10-minute debuff that removes your auto heal, reduces the damage you inflict by 20%, and deals a small amount of damage over time. This cast can be interrupted, but if you're playing as a red mage, you won't be able to do so. Instead, on lower floors, you can usually kill mimics before they inflict you with pox, and on higher floors, you can use Pomanders to help deal with them, as will be described later in this video. The type of chests that mimics could spawn from is dependent on which floor you're on. On floors 1 through 29, mimics spawn from bronze chests. On floors 31 through 39, mimics spawn from silver chests. And on floors 41 and above, mimics spawn from gold chests. The likelihood of a mimic spawning from a chest increases as you move up through Palace. Additionally, mimics also become much stronger on higher floors. Luckily, late floor mimics aren't even close to the most difficult enemies that you'll encounter, but they can still do extremely large amounts of damage and always seem to show up at the worst times. For a large portion of Palace, understanding enemy mechanics and proper target selection isn't particularly important because few of the enemies are dangerous enough to kill you, and an hour should be plenty of time to finish all the floors in a set. However, as enemies become more dangerous and time becomes an issue on the later floors, knowing which enemies to fight and when and how to fight them is essential. You want to select enemies which require you to use as few resources as possible and have the lowest chance of killing you. At the same time, you usually want to kill as few enemies as needed to clear a path to the exit and unlock the next floor. Getting additional kills is often just a waste of valuable time. In this section, we'll take a look at the different types of enemies that you'll encounter in Palace, and go over some general tips on how to choose which ones to fight. We won't go over every individual enemy here though, that'll happen later in the floor-by-floor guide. Enemies have two different movement types, and it's important to know which enemies fall under which group. An overwhelming majority of them will remain in the room they spawn in and move periodically every 20 to 30 seconds or so. The direction they move in isn't super predictable, but they generally prefer to move in a back and forth manner, meaning that if they move in one direction, they're much more likely to turn 90 degrees or more when they move the next time. It's very rare for them to move in the same direction twice in a row. Strangely, whenever a mob walks into the edge of the room, there's a chance that it'll turn once it reaches the edge to look towards the center of the room. Keep this in mind. You don't want to think that you're safe to pass behind a moving enemy for it to just turn around once it reaches the edge. A smaller group of enemies serve as patrols. Instead of staying in the same room, they'll roam between rooms until they hit a dead end, at which point they'll turn around and keep going until they reach another dead end. These enemies can be much more dangerous, since it's easy for them to sneak up on you while you're distracted with something else. Because of this, I generally prioritize killing patrols as soon as I can, so that they aren't alive to cause problems for me later, with a few exceptions in the 190s that I'll cover in the floor-by-floor guide. If you've played Palace before, you've probably noticed that some enemies don't notice you even if you're right behind them, while others will aggro as soon as you step anywhere near them. That's because there are 3 different types of aggro mechanisms. Understanding how each of these types work, and knowing which enemies fall under each type is extremely important. This information will allow you to avoid unnecessary battles, which becomes absolutely essential on the later floors. The first type, and the type which most enemies fall under, is sight aggro. These enemies have a frontal visual cone. If you're in the cone, they'll see you and attack. Stay behind them or to their sides, and you can slip right past them with ease. It's worth noting that all enemies, regardless of aggro type, will attack if you try to phase directly through them, so be sure to give at least a small amount of room when passing them. The second and rarest type is sound aggro. If you run anywhere in range of these enemies, they'll hear you in aggro, regardless of which direction they're looking. However, these enemies can be the easiest to avoid because if you start walking, they won't be able to hear you. If you don't know your walk key or don't even have it binded, I certainly don't blame you considering how useless it normally is, but you'll definitely want to get familiar with using it inside of Palace to help you avoid these enemies as needed. The third and worst type of aggro that enemies can be based off of is proximity. If you're anywhere within a certain range of these enemies, they'll aggro. This makes them extremely hard to avoid, as the only way to do so is to stay far away from them. Because of this, these enemies become the bane of your existence on later floors, and you'll be forced into fighting them often. Every enemy you encounter in Palace can usually be categorized into 1 or 2 groups depending on their mechanics. Each enemy within a group is still a little different from its fellow group members, but knowing which group an enemy falls under can still be useful since there are some general strategies that can be applied to almost all enemies within a group. The first and largest group is enemies that'll cast AoEs, telegraphed, untelegraphed, gaze mechanics, etc. This is generally the easiest group of enemies to fight on later floors, as long as you know how to avoid the untelegraphed attacks. Any time spent casting AoEs is time not spent damaging you with auto attacks, which you'll learn to greatly appreciate. The next group becomes more common and more dangerous as you progress through Palace, double auto attackers. They'll do a second attack that occurs every 10 to 15 seconds in addition to their normal auto attacks. On late floors, auto attacks already hurt quite a bit, so adding an additional attack on top of it can be brutal. Sustaining potions, Vercures, kiting, and eventually even steel become necessities for fighting these types of enemies. Another group that you'll encounter are enemies which auto-attack with ranged casts. Most of these also have another mechanic that falls under one of the other groups, but some will just continuously hit you with their ranged attack. These usually aren't particularly dangerous, but they do output very consistent damage because their attacks don't miss, and they can't be kited like normal auto attacks. Some enemies will inflict you with status effects. Depending on the status effect, they can range from being fairly easy to very hard to fight. Sometimes, if there's a cast time, you'll be able to move away fast enough to avoid being hit with the status effect. I'll point out which enemies this tactic can be used against in the floor-by-floor guide. An effective strategy for dealing with these types of enemies is to fight them in sequence if necessary, one after another, because there'll be a duration reduction each time the same status effect is inflicted. The normal duration the first time, then 50% of the full duration the next time, then 25%, and then full resistance. This reduction will reset if not inflicted with the same status effect within a minute, so it's important to fight enemies in quick succession if using this strategy. After being inflicted with the effect for 25% of the duration, the full resistance will last a minute and then be reset back to normal. There's a couple of enemies throughout Palace with enrages, and even the ones on earlier floors can be extremely dangerous if you aren't paying attention, or if something goes terribly wrong. Those on later floors can be especially tough because they're often able to survive long enough to enrage even if you're actively doing damage to them the entire time. Fortunately, for most of these enemies there are tactics that you can use to avoid the enrage. I'll point these out in the floor-by-floor guide. The final group contains the most dangerous of the enemies that you'll encounter. In the last 60 floors, there are 5 different enemies that'll inflict you with a dot. Not only does it do a significant amount of damage, but most of these enemies also have another tough mechanic to deal with at the same time. As you'll see in the floor-by-floor guide, you should generally always try to avoid fighting anything that falls in this group. Along with target selection, Pomander usage is the other most important decision-making ability that you'll need to develop to have a chance at clearing Palace. Pomanders are extremely strong tools that are absolutely essential both for surviving and clearing floors in an efficient manner. In this section, I'll explain the various Pomanders that you'll encounter throughout your adventures in Palace, and when and how they should be used to maximize their effectiveness. First, I'll cover a few basics that apply to all Pomanders. Poms are found in gold chests, and up to 3 of each type can be held in your inventory at one time. Effects do not stack if you use multiple Pomanders of the same type at once. There's a small amount of time during which you're locked into place while using a Pomander, so be sure that you aren't standing somewhere dangerous. A small quirk to note for Red Mage is that using a Pomander counts as an action that'll cancel your dual cast. Not a big deal, but something that always seems to catch me off guard whenever it happens to me. There's a total of 16 different Poms. I'll go over their effects and how to get the most value out of each of them. First on the list is the Pomander of Safety. When used, it'll remove all traps on the current floor. It can be used to save yourself time when navigating through rooms. For example, if there are enemies that'll aggro if you move along the edge, you can use a safety to allow yourself to quickly move through the middle of the room instead to avoid them. It can also be useful if you have to move through one of the types of rooms on the last 50 floors that could possibly contain a trap along the edge. I'll cover how you can identify these specific rooms later in the guide. Another good use is before using a Rage or Resolution Pomander, so you can maximize the effect of the transformation by being able to move freely without any concern of activating a trap. There's also times when chests may be located towards the middle of the room, either because of the layout, such as this donut room, or as a drop from killing an enemy. Using a safety can let you access these chests without having to worry about setting off a trap. One final thing to note about safety is that it only removes traps from the floor. Chests can still potentially contain mimics, and silver chests can still explode when opened. Next is the Pomander of Sight, which will reveal the map of the floor and all traps. All of the use cases that apply to the Safety Pomander also apply to the Sight one, but it has some additional uses that make it even more valuable. It can be used to find the exit and any chest on the floor, which will allow you to plan out your route more efficiently. This can be especially useful when using a Rage or Resolution Pomander. You'll know which way to go to clear a path to the exit, and especially with Rage, knowing where to go may leave you enough time to get usage out of the transformation on the next floor. There are also some use cases where having the traps visible but not removed can be useful. Each trap, when revealed, can be identified by a unique symbol. Most of them can be ignored, but there are scenarios where 2 certain traps can be purposely activated to your advantage. The first one is the landmine, which looks like this. Setting it off will cause you to lose 80% of your current health, but it has the same effect on any nearby enemies. Using it, and then finishing off an enemy can save quite a lot of time, especially on later floors where enemies have a significant amount of health. However, late floor enemies can also easily remove that last 20% of your health almost immediately, so I suggest using this trick on ones which won't aggro while you set off the trap, and using Vercure before engaging them. You can even slide cast the first Vercure in tandem with the landmine so that the cast goes off immediately after your health is lost, giving as little time as possible for the enemy to regenerate health. You can also use it on enemies that are casting, but note that the landmine trap works differently from Silver Chest explosions. Landmines will deal damage proportional to each target's current health, while Silver Chests deal damage proportional to each target's total health. This means that landmines will not kill an enemy directly. You'll have to follow up with some other source of damage to finish them off. The other trap that is worth remembering the symbol for is the luring trap. There are edge cases where these can be utilized to your advantage when paired with a Rage. You can activate the trap to get a quick 3 kills to open the exit, or you can use it when a fortune is active to hopefully get an extra chest or 2. The Pomander of Strength increases damage and healing done by 30% for 8 minutes. Both the damage and the healing are extremely useful as a red mage. First and foremost, the Strength Pomander acts as a time saver by allowing you to eliminate enemies faster. The more time you spend fighting during the duration of the buff, the more value you'll get out of it. This means it's especially valuable during boss fights, where you're continuously fighting for a long period of time. Additionally, for the last few bosses, using it can be important to ensure that the boss can be killed within the duration of a single steel Pomander. This advice can also be extended to other late non-boss floors where steel is extremely important. When popping a steel, pairing it with a strength will maximize the amount of progress you can make during the steel's duration. Interestingly, because it increases the effectiveness of Vercure, strength can also serve as somewhat of a mini-steal against tough enemies. While you'll still take just as much damage, being able to restore more health with each cast means less GCDs need to be spent using Vercure, and makes these fights much safer overall. There are a number of enemies throughout the later floors that are tough to fight without steel, but using strength alone can make many of them much easier to survive against. If you find a free strength, meaning that you already have 3 in your inventory and find another in a chest, don't always use it immediately. Instead, consider leaving it in the chest and using it later if you already have the effects of a strength running, or if you'll be able to get more value out of it by using it just before moving on to the next floor. For example, if you find a strength on the 9th floor of a set, it can be a good idea to not use it until it's time to fight the boss. Steel is the first of the 4 Pomanders that I would consider extremely important. It decreases damage taken by 40% for 8 minutes. On later floors, you'll need it for fighting a majority of the bosses and a significant number of the mobs. Because of this, managing your steel economy and maximizing the value that you get out of each one is absolutely essential for clearing as a red mage. Generally, you'll want to progress through the later floors as far as possible until you reach a situation where you absolutely have to use a steel to keep moving forward. In the floor-by-floor guide, I'll give more details on how to manage your steel on each floor set and which enemies can and cannot be fought without steel. As mentioned earlier, a good general tip is to pair strength with steel to maximize the total effectiveness. It can also be a good idea to use flight when you have a steel running for the same reason. Less enemies on the next floor will allow you to clear it faster and progress further during the steel's uptime. On later floors, having a steel up can also be helpful when using a transformation Pomander, either Rage or Resolution, as reducing the damage taken from any auto attacks will reduce the amount of time needed to stop to auto heal. Most of the time, I wouldn't suggest using steel specifically for transformations, but it can be very helpful if you already happen to have steel running. Even more importantly than strength, if you find a free steel, think carefully about the best time to use it. Once again, if you already have the effects of steel running, it can be a good idea to wait to use the free one. If enemies on the current floor can be fought safely without steel, but ones on future floors are tougher, you can delay using the free steel until you're about to exit onto the next floor. On floors where there are a number of enemies that can only be fought with steel, it can be a good idea to kill any that can be fought without it, then use the free steel to clear out the tougher enemies afterwards. Finally, getting a free steel on the 9th floor of a set is absolutely fantastic. If possible, save it for the boss, and enjoy going into the next set with 3 steals. The Pomander of Affluence will increase the chance for treasure coffers on the next floor. Use it whenever you find yourself low on Pomanders. I usually end up using them in the 180s and early 190s. When using a Pomander of Flight, it can be a good idea to pair Affluence with it. Fewer enemies will make it easier to access the additional chests that appear on the next floor. Also, be sure not to use Affluence on the 9th floor of a set. Unfortunately, it won't cause any treasure coffers to spawn next to the boss. The Pomander of Flight reduces the number of enemies that appear on the next floor, and decreases the number of kills needed to open the exit for that floor. This is a second extremely important Pomander for progressing through the later floors, as using a flight usually shrinks the number of kills needed to open the exit to somewhere between 2 and 5, saving a massive amount of time. Additionally, a reduced number of enemies makes floors much easier to navigate, and results in less situations where you're forced to fight the toughest enemies. As with steel, I'll give more detailed tips on when I prefer to use my flights in the floor-by-floor guide. Once again, pairing Affluence with Flight is a good combo, as well as using it when steel is running on the tough late floors. However, avoid pairing Flight with Alteration. If you get free ones on the same floor, you can use them together, but it's counterintuitive to stack them otherwise, as Flight's effect reduces the effectiveness of the Alteration by decreasing the number of Mimics or Mandragoras that'll spawn. As with Affluence, remember to not use Flight on the 9th floor of a set. I guarantee that the boss will still be there, regardless of how many flights you use. The Pomander of Alteration transforms a room of enemies on the next floor into either Mimics or Mandragoras. If transformed into Mimics, they'll be revealed and will aggro based off of a large proximity. On the other hand, Mandragoras are non-hostile enemies that can be one-shotted. Using this Pomander can serve a couple different purposes. Both Mimics and Mandragoras have a much higher chance of dropping chests than normal enemies, so you can use it when low on Pomanders to try and restore your inventory. The second reason is to save time by possibly reducing the number of kills you need to obtain on the next floor. A room full of Mandragoras serves as a room full of fast, free kills towards opening the exit. The final reason is to give yourself more options to fight on certain floors, especially the mid to late 180s where Mimics are still doable without steel as a red mage, but many of the normal mobs aren't. Regardless of whether the alteration results in Mimics or Mandragoras, you're guaranteed to have at least one room full of enemies that can be taken care of without steel, assuming no floor debuffs. Personally though, I like to use Alteration most in the early 190s, where transforming a room can result in 1 or 2 less enemy patrols. I'll talk more about this strategy in the floor-by-floor guide for the 190s. As with Flight and Affluence, don't use Alteration on the 9th floor of a set. It won't have any effect. The Pomander of Purity removes the Accursed Pox status that is inflicted by Mimics. This is a very important Pomander for Red Mage, because it doesn't have an interrupt to use on Mimics, meaning that you'll likely find yourself getting hit with Pox pretty frequently. However, on late floors, your first impulse shouldn't be to use Purity as soon as you're inflicted with Pox. While it's not a bad idea if you're at 3 Purities, the last thing you want is to burn a Purity to just encounter another Mimic again a few minutes later. Instead, you should primarily look to use your Purities in 3 different scenarios. The first is when you're running low on time, in which case you'll want to get rid of the damage reduction inflicted by the Pox. The second is before using a Rage or Resolution Pomander. You won't be able to heal yourself while transformed, so losing the ability to auto-heal because of Pox can force you to exit the transformation early if you take too much damage. The last and most important situation to use it in is just before a boss fight. You don't want to deal with the damage reduction, the auto-heal penalty, or the dot while taking on any of the later bosses. Other than these situations, I usually just keep my Purities and ride out the Pox. Fortune increases the likelihood of enemies dropping treasure chests for the current floor. Similar to Affluence, this is a good Pomander to use whenever you're running low on Poms. While normally as few kills as possible to activate the exit is ideal for time management, the effectiveness of Fortune increases the more kills that you obtain on the floor. Because of this, it can be best paired with Rage if you aren't planning on using the Rage across 2 floors. Clearing an entire floor of enemies with Fortune running is almost certain to result in at least a few drop chests. Conversely, avoid using Fortune with Flight, as flighted floors require less kills, and thus are the least effective time to use Fortune. The Pomander of Witching will turn all nearby enemies into either an imp, a chicken, or a frog for 30 seconds. All of these transformations will result in the enemy only doing auto attacks for the duration of the effect, but imps will do about 60% of the enemy's normal damage, chickens will do around 30%, and frogs will do virtually no damage at all. This Pomander is fantastic when something goes wrong, and you have to hit the panic switch, whether that be an accidental aggro or hitting a luring trap. On earlier floors, the effect will last long enough to kill one or multiple enemies. However, on the late floors, the duration of one witching might not be long enough to even kill one full health enemy, meaning that it becomes more of a way to buy yourself time to decide your next move, rather than the solution to the problem. Depending on how bad the situation is after you use a witching, you can decide to chain together multiple witchings, use a rage to eliminate the problematic enemies, use a steal and fight, or use a raising and prepare to take a death. To make things worse, if transformed into imps, late floor enemies will still do a significant amount of damage, and are also able to interrupt your cast with their attacks. Pay attention to what enemies are transformed into, and don't let your guard down if you see any imps. Additionally, while mobs cannot use skills while transformed, their cooldowns will still decrease over the course of the transformation, meaning that they'll often use their skills as soon as the effect wears off. One great use for witching is to use it before a mimic inflicts you with pox. However, once again, mimics on very late floors might not be killable in the duration of a single witching before it transforms back and attempts to pox you again, so I would only suggest using witchings to stop pox if you have 3 available and you know that the mimic will die within the witching's duration. The final use for witching is to allow you to fight enemies, which you normally wouldn't be able to fight. If you're forced into a situation where you need to kill an enemy that would require you to use a steal, or even one that shouldn't be fought with steal, you can use a witching to safely kill it instead. Just be sure that you can finish it off before the effect wears off. Serenity removes all enchantments from the current floor. On every non-boss floor, there's a random chance for floor enchantments to appear. These enchantments provide buffs and debuffs for you and your enemies. Later floors have a high rate of floor debuffs, which can make some extremely difficult or even impossible to clear without using a Serenity. Because of this, Serenity is the third of the extremely important Pomanders, and you'll want to try to hold on to them as long as possible for whenever you encounter a floor with a really bad set of debuffs. Later in this guide, I'll go over a full list of possible floor enchantments, and throughout the floor-by-floor guide, I'll give tips on when and where I would suggest using your Serenities. The Pomander of Rage is the last of the big 4 Pomanders, and the most powerful of all. It'll transform you for 1 minute into a manticore capable of one-shotting every non-boss enemy that you encounter. This primarily serves 3 possible purposes. First of all, it can be used to save a massive amount of time by not needing to fight enemies normally. Second, it can be used to handle extremely dangerous enemies without using a steal and taking a risky fight. Lastly, it can be used for specific situations which require a high number of kills, such as when dealing with the aftermath of a luring trap or a treasure room. Because of how powerful Rage is, getting maximum value out of this Pomander is essential. One of the best strategies for doing so is to utilize the transformation across 2 floors. Clear out a portion of a floor, then use a Rage to finish off the last few kills. Go through the exit while still transformed, which will take about 15 seconds, and use the remainder of the time to get a few kills on the next floor. This is extremely useful for the 180s and 190s, where you'll start to encounter a large number of enemies that can only be fought normally with steal. Using a Rage to clear out a portion of 2 floors, instead of using a steal, is a fantastic idea that you'll certainly want to utilize. There's usually a couple of things to consider before using a Rage. Ideally, you want to check as many chests as possible before raging. This way, if one of them is a mimic, you can use the Rage to kill it, whereas if you rage and then check the chest after, you'd have to deal with that same mimic without the help of the Rage. Also, before using a Rage, it's a good idea to have a route planned out, especially if you're trying to carry the transformation onto the next floor as well, in which case you'll need to think about exactly how many kills you might need to get before opening the exit. As mentioned before, being afflicted with pox while raging can be extremely dangerous because you won't be able to auto-heal yourself if you get damaged. heavily consider using a purity if you're planning to rage. Finally, before using a rage, always double check the floor enchantments and ensure knockback isn't disabled. Knockback is required to one-shot enemies, meaning that instead of an instant kill, only a small amount of damage will be done if this debuff is active, rendering the Rage Pomander useless. While using a rage, always remember that being able to one-shot enemies doesn't make you invincible. Auto-attack damage from late floor enemies needs to be avoided as much as possible. At the least, you'll be forced to stop and wait as your health regenerates, and taking enough damage can force you to exit the transformation early to heal, or even result in a death if you aren't careful. Be especially aware when raging in an area with multiple enemies that aggro by proximity. The damage can add up fast if you piss all of them off at the same time. A good strategy is to pop a sustaining potion before using a rage. This will give you some extra healing if you take any damage during the first portion of the transformation. As mentioned before, it's usually a good idea to use Safety Your Sight before raging. This will allow you to safely enter the center of rooms to hit enemies without setting off a trap. Landmines in particular can be especially dangerous. Hitting one and then getting hit by an aggroed enemy is a very easy way to die. Additionally, there's an extremely rare interaction where if an enemy is damaged by a landmine and then hit while its HP is regenerating, it may survive with a small amount of health instead of being one-shotted. Hitting a luring trap in a room with multiple other enemies can be a problem as well, so just another reason to reveal or clear out traps with a Safety Your Sight. If using a sight, it has the added benefit of revealing the exit if it's still hidden. This can help direct the path of your rage so you can ensure the exit is cleared before the transformation ends. Once again, Fortune is also a very good Pomander to stack with Rage if you aren't planning on carrying it across 2 floors, and Steel can help mitigate auto attack damage if you happen to already have it up and running. Lust transforms you for 1 minute into a succubus capable of using Void Fire 2, an AoE attack that'll add a stack of vulnerability to any enemies hit by it, up to a maximum of 5 stacks, which will result in them taking 50% additional damage. On later floors, it's primarily useful against bosses alone, as normal enemies don't have enough health to get the full benefit of the vulnerability stacks, but are also too strong to pull multiple at the same time to take advantage of the AoE damage. When using it against a boss, you can almost always open with Lust at the very start. Be sure to pop a sustaining pot before using it. The only exception to this rule is the 190 boss, where you'll want to use the Lust at a later point during the fight because the initial damage is too much to handle without Vercure. As soon as you have 5 stacks, you can exit the transformation and fight the boss normally. You can refresh all 5 stacks of vulnerability with a second Lust by hitting the boss with 1 stack before the existing vulnerability falls off, but this primarily only applies to the floor 190 boss, as you most likely won't be using multiple Lusts against any other bosses unless you're really short on time. The Pomander of Intuition reveals the location of the Accursed Horde. As tempting as a chance at a Night Pegasus mount might be aware that traps can spawn next to or on top of Horde locations. My only advice is to be smart and don't sacrifice your run in the name of greed. The Pomander of Raising will revive you if KO'd. This is the ultimate get-out-of-jail-free card. It's a good idea to use it whenever you feel unfamiliar or uncomfortable with a set of floors. Personally, for my own runs, I start using a Raising on the 170s, since that's the point at which I have a high likelihood of dying for the rest of the run. Don't be afraid to take advantage of its effect. In some scenarios, it may be best to take a death and be raised, even if there's a way to survive the situation. For example, if you set off a luring trap on the later floors, it could be better to run a short distance away from the enemy's spawn positions and accept your death rather than invest multiple witchings or a rage to keep yourself alive. Also, if you plan on using it for a set, be sure to remember to actually use it. Trust me, there's no worse feeling than forgetting to use it and then failing the duty because you have the memory of a goldfish. The Pomander of Resolution transforms you into Kuriboh for 1 minute, allowing you to use the Heavenly Judge spell, which can stun enemies and does a large amount of damage to undead. This is a highly situational Pomander. Most of the time, it's fairly useless. However, it can be used to quickly clear floors that contain undead enemies, including the floor 140 boss, enemies throughout the mid to late 140s, and enemies throughout the 190s. When using one, it's important to understand which enemies are considered undead and which aren't. Using it against non-undead enemies isn't effective, so you'll want to avoid those ones entirely while transformed. Also, especially for the 190s where it takes 3 hits to kill enemies, it's important to understand which enemies are immune to the stun effect so that you know where to position your follow-up cast. For enemies that are stunnable, you can cast the second one again directly on top of the enemy, then the third one right next to the enemy, but between you and the enemy for when it moves towards you after the stun effect wears off. For those that aren't stunnable, your second cast will be placed between yourself and the enemy, and the third one will be right on top of yourself. With some practice, you should be able to get a pretty good feel for the positioning of the follow-up cast in both scenarios. There are some other important mechanics that you'll encounter throughout Palace. I'll start by covering traps. Every room, other than the one you start in, has a chance of spawning one trap. As mentioned earlier, the best way to avoid setting off traps is to run along the edge of rooms. There'll still be situations where you set off a trap, but it happens significantly less often. Additionally, the last 50 floors all use the same set of rooms, so it's possible to memorize which rooms could possibly have a trap along the edge. If you avoid these areas completely, or use a safety or sight pomander to bypass them, then you can almost entirely eliminate the number of traps you hit as long as you're always hugging the edge in all other rooms. There are two rooms in particular that spawn a trap along the edge extremely frequently. Both of them are dead-end rooms, with the trap spawning on the right side near the entrance. The first one is this room with steps going up towards the middle, and a bunch of giant floating blocks forming a wall at the back. The second room is commonly referred to as Stonehenge. It has 4 sets of boxes stacked on top of each other. There are a number of other rooms that spawn traps either along the edge or extremely near it, but I find these ones to be much less common than the 2 I listed before, so I haven't bothered memorizing the spots for these other traps. If you're interested in seeing these other spots, I suggest checking out the video created by Japanese player Noriben. I put the link in the description. No matter how careful you are, you'll still encounter situations where you accidentally set off a trap. I'll go over the different possible traps now, and how to deal with the aftermath of activating them. Luring is the most dangerous trap. It'll spawn 3 enemies directly on top of you. On earlier floors, you can use witching or steel to handle the situation, but during the later floors, a witching is only enough to buy you some time, and steel won't keep you alive against multiple enemies. Instead, you have a few different options. The first is to run away from the room where the enemies spawned, use a raising if the effect isn't already active, and then purposely die to the enemies. By running away from where the enemies spawned, you can avoid aggroing them again after being revived. The other option is to use a rage. Depending on how much damage the enemies do, and how fast you react, you may want to use a witching first to ensure that you survive long enough during the transformation to kill all 3. Landmines are the next trap. They'll damage you for 80% of your current health. As mentioned before, they also do damage to any nearby enemies, which can be used to your advantage. Be fast if you set off a landmine while fighting something. Swift cast for cure, and pop a max or super potion as quick emergency heals, or else you'll probably die. The toading trap will turn you into a toad for 20 seconds, which prevents you from taking any actions and lowers your maximum HP. This is extremely dangerous. If you hit it while an enemy is aggroed on the later floors, your only hope is to start running away and pray that you avoid enough damage to survive. The impeding trap will silence and pacify you and all nearby enemies for 30 seconds. This seems to be one of the rarer traps on the later floors, but it can still be quite dangerous, even if it also silences enemies. In fact, since a majority of damage from enemies comes from their auto attacks, some actually become much more difficult to fight if silenced. You can actually use echo drops to remove the silence, but it shares a cooldown with your sustaining pot that'll last 60 seconds, so this isn't always a good idea if you know that you'll need the extra healing soon. The last is the enfeebling trap, which will increase the amount of damage you take and reduce the amount of damage you deal for a minute. This trap also seems to be less common on later floors, but can still be very dangerous to set off while fighting hard-hitting mobs. If this happens, focus on healing yourself to deal with the increased damage, or use witching or steel pomanders as necessary. Every non-boss floor, other than the first floor of a set, has a chance of being affected by enchantments. Enchantments provide a large range of effects that can buff or debuff you or your enemies. The frequency of enchantments tends to increase as you progress through Palace, though some floors, such as the 150s, seem to have a significantly higher number of enchantments than surrounding floors. At maximum, there can be 2 enchantments active at the same time on a floor, as well as a third effect called Gloom that buffs enemies. As mentioned before, all enchantments, including Gloom, can be dispelled using a Pomander of Serenity. Knowing when to use this Pomander is extremely important, and we'll continue to discuss it throughout this entire guide. For now, I'll provide a list of all the possible enchantments. First up is the buffs. Haste is the first and more helpful of the two possible buffs that you'll encounter, and will allow you to progress through a floor significantly faster. The other buff is HP MP up. The extra health can make fights a little safer on the later floors when going against hard-hitting enemies, but it isn't a huge difference. The first debuff is HP down. This is actually one of the more dangerous debuffs, and becomes very problematic on later floors when you take on tough enemies, especially double auto attackers. There's a number of situations where enemies would normally be safe to fight, but can become much more dangerous with a reduced amount of HP. When paired with Gloom or another bad debuff on late floors, it can often be a good idea to use a Serenity. Knockback disabled might not seem to do much until you use a Rage Pomander, at which point you'll realize that you've made a huge mistake. Knockback is required for Rage to one-shot enemies, so hitting an enemy while this debuff is active will only do a small amount of damage. Once again, always remember to double check that this debuff isn't around before using a Rage Pomander. If you absolutely need to use Rage to clear the floor, you'll have to use a Serenity beforehand. It's also worth mentioning that the knockback disabled effect also applies to you. There are a few enemies throughout Palace that have mechanics that'll pull you in towards them. If knockback is disabled, you won't move an inch, so this debuff can occasionally work in your favor. Next up is damage decreased. This isn't too bad of a debuff, but it will increase the amount of time it takes for you to progress through the floor. Similarly, the next debuff, Blinded, will also reduce the pace at which you're able to deal damage and clear the floor. This one is much more RNG dependent, and its effects can be much greater for some jobs compared to others. As a red mage, the melee combo can be dropped if an attack misses, but otherwise the effect isn't too bad. The third of the debuffs that reduce your damage output is Abilities Unavailable. Because of the amount of damage that red mage outputs using OGCDs, Abilities Unavailable is the worst debuff in terms of time efficiency. Any floors with this debuff will take a long time to clear, so it may be worth using a Serenity if time is an issue, especially if paired with Gloom or other negative enchantments. The next debuff is Sprint Disabled. This is mostly just an annoyance rather than a problem. On the other end of the danger scale is Items Unavailable, the worst debuff of all. Not only does it prevent you from using any Pomanders, but it also prevents you from being able to use Sustaining Pots. Fighting without Sustaining Pots becomes virtually impossible once you reach the last floors of Palace, meaning that this debuff can often require an automatic Serenity if it shows up at that point. Auto Heal Disabled is one of the least dangerous debuffs, but it's important to heal between fights whenever it's active. This debuff has the greatest effect when using either a Pomander of Rage or Resolution, since the only healing you'll be able to get during the transformation is from using a Sustaining Pot just beforehand, and that healing will only last for the first portion of the transformation. Last but not least, Gloom has 3 effects. It increases the damage done, decreases the damage taken, and increases the movement speed of all enemies. Not only is this effect dangerous on its own, but it's also the only floor enchantment that appears independently of all the other ones, meaning that you can get a combination of 2 of the previously mentioned enchantments, paired with Gloom as a third one on top. These double debuff plus Gloom floors can obviously be insanely dangerous or straight up impossible depending on the debuffs, and you'll almost certainly run into a couple that will force the usage of a Serenity. Finally, there are a few rare additional scenarios that you'll likely encounter at least a few times throughout your adventures in Palace. The first and more common one is treasure rooms. A treasure room will spawn 4 chests at the corners of the room, but also contains an extremely large number of enemies, usually around 10. On lower floors, taking your time to clear out the room isn't a problem, and the additional treasure chests are nice. However, on later floors, it can be long and dangerous to clear out a treasure room, which especially becomes an issue if the exit is located within it or in a room past it. There's a few strategies that you can use in these situations. The easiest is to use a Rage Pomander to clear out all the enemies. If you choose to do this, be careful if there's a large number of enemies that aggro by proximity, and also be sure to use a Fortune to hopefully get a few extra chests from all those kills. Another option, if the exit is located past a treasure room, is to pop a Raising and run through the room as fast as you can. You'll die if you aggro several enemies, but also be raised on the other side of the treasure room if you make it out. For both of these strategies, I would highly suggest using a safetier sight to make sure you don't hit an unfortunate trap in the middle of the room. The second, much rarer scenario is unique enemies that appear throughout all of Palace. These are extremely rare. I would say on any given run, there's a good chance you might not even encounter one, and if you do, it'll likely be on the earlier floors where they aren't tough. But on the later floors, if you see an enemy that isn't listed in the floor-by-floor guide, then it's one of these unique enemies. Just like mimics, they aggro by proximity and have a higher chance of dropping treasure chests, but they're often even tougher because they'll only hit you with auto attacks. Additionally, they're not affected by witching, so you can't use that to save yourself against them. In general, once you reach the 170s, I would recommend to avoid fighting any unique enemies you see if you don't have steel running. In the floor-by-floor walkthrough, I'll be covering the last 61 floors of Palace, which is where both new and experienced runners seem to have the most difficulty. If you're having trouble with the first 139 floors, I highly suggest taking a look at Maygi's guide. It covers the enemies and bosses on those floors in detail. For each of the floors in my walkthrough, I'll cover mechanics and strategies for every enemy you'll encounter, suggestions for how you should be looking to use your Pomanders, and an in-depth guide for each of the bosses. I'll split each floor setup into 4 sections, covering the early, middle, and late floors in the first 3 sections, and the boss in the 4th section. For each of the first 3 sections, I'll start by providing a list of the enemies that'll commonly be found on those 3 floors, and end with giving the general strategy that I follow. For every enemy, I'll display an icon in the lower left to indicate whether it aggroes based off of sight, sound, or proximity. If an enemy is a patrol, it'll be indicated using this icon. Finally, I'll use a set of emotes to illustrate the difficulty of each enemy on a scale of so easy that you'll fall asleep to only fight if you have a death wish. Especially take care to pay attention to enemies at this level of difficulty. For these, it'll be highly recommended or even required for you to have steel running if you take them on. Note that enemies aren't restricted to just appearing exclusively in the early, mid, or late floors. They may show up on floors that cover 2 different sections, but I've placed each of them into the one where you're most likely to start seeing them frequently. While I won't be covering the other floors in the 131 to 140 set, I wanted to start the floor-by-floor guide with Upwash, the floor 140 boss. Fighting him normally can be pretty tough, but because he's undead, he can be absolutely shredded by a Pomander of Resolution. I recommend having both strength and steel running, otherwise you'll have to exit the transformation early to heal, and then use a second resolution to finish off the boss. Pop a sustaining potion, and use the resolution. If you have a good connection, and can time your slide cast well, there's an exact pattern that you can follow. You should be able to get 3 cast off before he uses his first AoE, then 2 more casts before you'll need to move again. Then back to 3 casts. Back to 2 casts. And then back to 3 casts once more before moving one last time. If you don't execute this perfectly, don't worry. Just dodge the AoEs and hit him with a few extra heavenly judges at the end. And if you miss out on a few casts, don't be afraid to exit the transformation, heal yourself up, then use a second resolution to finish him off. If it makes you more comfortable, you can also use the resolution to destroy the adds when they spawn so that their damage doesn't add up as you finish off the boss. The first full set of floors that I'll cover in this walkthrough is floors 141 to 150. At this point, all enemies will be doing a decent amount of damage, so you'll always want to be pulling one at a time. But as long as you're fighting single targets, only a few enemies in this set hit hard enough to be considered dangerous, and they certainly shouldn't be too much of a problem if you're using sustaining pots to help deal with them. Mimics also aren't much of a problem at this point either. You won't be able to kill one before it inflicts you with pox unless you use a witching, but their damage is very manageable. If you haven't been conserving Pomanders, now would be a good time to start. Ideally, you want to become comfortable with this set to the point where you don't have to use any Pomanders at all to clear it. However, if it's one of your first times running through this set, definitely use Pomanders as necessary to keep yourself comfortable and ensure you finish in time. It's much better to spend Pomanders and make some progress than it is to die early with a full inventory. Of course, this advice applies to all the floors that I'm covering in this walkthrough. If you're still learning to progress through them, don't feel as if you need to conserve and use your Pomanders exactly as I suggest, because my suggestions are geared towards clearing all 200 floors. If you're having trouble reaching past a certain set, then you should be adjusting your Pomander usage to focus on clearing those floors instead. As for this set, I do personally like to use Strength, Steel, and Lust for the boss, but it's very doable without all of those. It just ends up being a very long fight. The Ked is the simplest enemy to fight in the early 140s. It'll frequently cast a long column AoE that can be dodged easily by moving to the side. Other than that, it'll just do normal auto attacks. The Demon is generally another easy enemy to fight on these floors, but it does come with some caveats. It uses an additional ranged attack alongside its normal auto attack, but it doesn't deal too much damage. After 30 seconds is when it becomes dangerous. It'll cast Charybdis, which does damage equal to 90% of your total HP. If you find yourself in an unfortunate situation and engaging multiple enemies at once, always focus on killing the demon first before it's able to cast this, and consider using Witching if you have multiple demons aggroed at the same time. Gargoyles are the most dangerous enemy on this entire floor set. They'll put a poison dot on you, and then follow up with a double auto attack. This repeats every 15 seconds. They do a lot of damage compared to the other enemies on these floors, so I'd highly recommend avoiding them, as all other options are much easier. If you do end up having to fight one, use some sustaining pots and kite them to help deal with the damage. The patrol enemy for the early 140s is the Manticore. It'll charge into you as soon as it aggroes, and then buff its damage for 30 seconds. While this buff is up, it'll do a significant amount of damage with its auto attacks, so be careful and heal yourself if necessary. After buffing itself, it has two attacks that it'll use, Ripper Claw and Fireball. Ripper Claw is an untelegraphed frontal cone AoE that can do a significant amount of damage. You can avoid it by running away or through the Manticore. Fireball is just a basic telegraphed AoE that can be sidestepped. Amusingly, after the buff drops, the Manticore's damage will actually decrease for 30 seconds, during which time it becomes very weak. Manticores become especially dangerous when they sneak up on you while you're already engaged with another enemy, because they'll use their gap closer and hit you with an auto attack as soon as they aggro. Keep your head on a swivel for them. They do have very loud footsteps, so you may be able to hear them coming before you see them. Knights will begin to show up after the first floor. They'll use a double auto attack, which can hurt a pretty decent amount. After 45 seconds, they'll buff themselves and do double damage for a short period, but chances are that they'll never survive long enough for you to see this. They do pretty high damage compared to some of their counterparts on this floor set, so keep an eye on your HP and heal if necessary. I would say that these early floors are the most dangerous of the entire set. I target Keds and Demons first and foremost. Avoid Gargoyles, and keep an eye out for Manticore patrols. If things really go wrong and you find yourself accidentally aggroing a Gargoyle or a Manticore when fighting another enemy, don't be afraid to use a Witching or even a Steel to help deal with the situation. Boots usually start showing up around floor 143 and are an easy enemy to target for these middle floors. They don't hit hard, but will cast Paralyze 3, which will paralyze you for 12 seconds. You can avoid getting hit if you start running away as soon as the cast begins. Consider using Sprinter Displacement to make it even easier to avoid. However, breaking line of sight doesn't work. You have to outdistance the cast to avoid being paralyzed. If you do get paralyzed, it's not dangerous, but it is annoying. Hellhounds also begin showing up around the same time as Boots. They have a double auto attack, and their damage output is very similar to the Knights, so heal if necessary. However, because they are side aggro, they can be avoided more easily than the Knights, and I usually avoid fighting them, as there are plenty of easier enemies to choose from instead. Wraiths are the patrol for the middle floors of this set. They are identical to other Wraiths in the earlier floors of Palace. They'll cast an extremely large AoE called Scream, but it has a long cast time that makes it easily avoidable. Be careful where you position yourself when fighting Wraiths. You'll want to make sure that you have an escape route for the Scream that won't result in you aggroing other enemies. Also be aware that they are proximity aggro, so they can be hard to dodge if one decides to wander near you. Succubi are an easy option to fight as long as you avoid their AoEs. After being aggroed, they'll cast a circular AoE around themselves called Dark Mist, which will inflict terror for 10 seconds. They'll then follow up with Voidfire 4, a circular AoE which does a decent bit of damage. Make sure to avoid Dark Mist in particular, as it'll result in you getting hit by Void Fire and a couple of auto attacks before you're able to act again, which will probably kill you if you don't have Steel running. Succubi will also target you with random AoEs when nearby but not aggroed. They'll cast it before or during their movement. Just be aware that you may have to dodge some random AoEs when fighting other enemies, and be aware when trying to move past them. They could turn to cast and aggro immediately. These floors are more straightforward than the early ones. Pick off boots, wraiths, and succubi as necessary to open the exit. Just keep an eye out for random AoEs from succubi, and be sure to position yourself properly when fighting wraiths. Persona are almost entirely identical to boots, except their proximity aggro instead of sound. They also cast Paralyze 3, which can again be avoided by distancing yourself from them as soon as the cast starts. Onyx Dragons begin showing up around floor 147. They'll first use a frontal cone sight mechanic called Evil Eye, then follow up with Miasma Breath, a telegraphed frontal cone AoE. The easiest way to avoid these two attacks is to face tank directly in front of the dragon, move through it as a cast Evil Eye, and then move through it again when it turns around to cast Miasma Breath. Keepers are the patrol for the later floors of this set. Similar to Knights and Hellhounds, they'll continuously auto-attack and have a double auto-attack that they'll use every 15 seconds. However, they hit a bit harder, so consider using a sustaining pot when fighting them. The good news is that they're extremely easy to avoid. Just be sure to start walking whenever they come near. Once again, these floors are also very straightforward. Focus on fighting personas, dragons, and succubi. Continue to watch out for random succubi AoEs and patrolling keepers. If you have any Pomanders of Resolution left over after the floor 140 boss, now is a good time to use them. With Heavenly Judge, you can two-shot personas, dragons, and keepers, and other than some adds on floor 150, you won't find any more undead enemies until the 190s, by which time you'll almost certainly have picked up another 3 resolution palms. The floor 150 boss is Tisiphone. She's not the most difficult or hardest hitting boss, but she does have a lot of mechanics and can take a long time to fight. Personally, I prefer to use Lust, Strength, and Steel when fighting her, but she can be done without any palms at all. However, if you're going to try to conserve palms, be sure that you have enough time left. This boss heals herself over the course of the fight, so the faster you kill her, the less she'll be able to heal. Because of this, there's an extremely large variance in the time it takes to beat her, depending on the palms that you use. With a Lust, Strength, and Steel, she takes under 5 minutes. With just Strength and Lust, that increases to about 5.5 minutes, since you'll need to use some more GCDs to procure. With Lust alone, it increases to a 9-minute fight, and can be up around 11 minutes if you don't use any palms at all. If you're really running out of time, and are efficient with your DPS, you can actually use 2 Lust along with the Strength and Steel, and finish her off in only 3.5 minutes, but only do this if time is really an emergency, since you don't want to be entering the 150s with only 1 Lust. This fight involves dodging a lot of AoEs, and dealing with a few unique mechanics. Especially focus on avoiding her Dark Mist AoE whenever she uses it. If you get hit by this, you'll be inflicted with terror, and most likely die even with Steel active. She'll open the fight with a basic telegraphed AoE, then call in untargetable add which will cast a line AoE after a short amount of time. At the same time, she'll cast another circular AoE around herself, so be sure to move in a direction that takes you out of both of these AoEs. Next, she'll summon 4 zombies at the 4 corners of the room. These zombies will slowly move towards you, and once nearby, will grab onto you, preventing you from moving until the zombie is killed. At the same time, Tisiphone will cast a number of AoEs, and summon an untargetable add which will cast another AoE, meaning that getting grabbed and rooted by a zombie will likely result in you getting hit by an AoE or 2. Because of this, it's extremely important to be aware of the zombies' positions, and deal with them as necessary to avoid being grabbed. There's 3 strategies that you can use. The zombies are weak to arrow magic, so hitting them with a Ver Arrow is an instant kill. This means that you can target Tisiphone with a Jolter Ver Stone, then swap to one of the zombies and eliminate it with Ver Arrow. Rinse and repeat 4 times, and the zombies are all taken care of. The second option is to stand towards the center of the room when the zombies spawn and group them up together. It might be tough to group them up cleanly because you'll have to keep moving to avoid the AoEs, but you should be able to get them close enough. If Contra 6 is off cooldown and you have Strength running, you can then use it for an instant kill on all of the zombies. Otherwise, you can use Barrero 2 and Jolt 2 to AoE them down pretty quickly. The third strategy also involves grouping up the zombies. Because they're undead, you can one-shot all of them with Heavenly Judge if you have any resolution Pomanders. However, as a red mage, the zombies are easy enough to handle without the help of resolution, and I personally never bother using it here. After casting her medley of AoEs, the boss will summon a succubus ad. This ad will primarily hit you with auto attacks and a cleave, so you'll start taking much more damage at this point. Be prepared to heal with sustaining pots and Vercure if necessary, especially if you don't have steel up and running. As usual, the boss will continue to harass you with a few AoEs. Eventually, the ad will stop moving to cast an AoE, and the boss will cast Fatal Allure. This will destroy the ad and restore the boss's health with all of the ad's remaining health. Because she drains the ad's health, it doesn't matter which one you target during this entire time. You can attack the boss, or you can attack the ad instead, and the end result will still be the same. If you attack the boss the entire time and the ad has full HP, Fatal Allure will restore about 12% of her total health. After this, she'll cast Blood Rain, which is a global AoE that'll do a large chunk of damage, especially if you don't have steel. Be sure that your health is topped off before getting hit by this attack, and be ready to Vercure afterwards, as it does damage equal to nearly 80% of your HP without steel. This cycle will repeat until the boss is dead. Once you finish her off, congrats on completing the first 150 floors. Next up is the 150s. As mentioned before, the rooms and visuals for these last 50 floors are all the same, but at least they look really good. Enemies do a little bit more damage on this set compared to their counterparts on the 140s, so expect to increase your usage of sustaining pots as necessary to help offset that increase in damage. This applies to mimics as well, though they still aren't very dangerous at this point. Once again, you want to be conserving Pomanders as much as possible on this set. It's worth noting that this set seems to have a very high rate of floor debuffs. I would say every debuff combo can still be fought through on these floors, but it can certainly be very dangerous, even for experienced players. If you get a particularly bad combo and don't feel comfortable fighting through it, use a Serenity as needed. I usually try to avoid using Serenity as much as possible because of how important they are for later floors, but if I encounter a particularly bad Gloom, no items, abilities disabled, and or maximum HP decreased floor, even I sometimes go ahead and use a Serenity if I still have 3 available. While the normal floors themselves aren't too bad, as long as you don't get screwed by floor debuffs, I would consider the boss for this set to be quite a big jump in difficulty. He hits extremely hard compared to everything else you've taken on in Palace so far, so you'll definitely want to use at least steel to deal with him. If you're efficient with your damage, you should be able to bring him down within the 8-minute steel duration without the help of other Poms. If you aren't fully comfortable with the boss's mechanics, use Strength and or Lust to ensure that the boss dies within the steel's uptime. Shabti are the patrols for the early 150s. They'll frequently spam a long line AoE called Death's Door. It has a very fast cast time, so cancel your own cast when you see it appear. Also, be careful when using Core and Displacement. If used at the wrong time, these will lock you into position and make it impossible to avoid the AoE. Puddings are casters that'll hit you with ranged attacks. When they're first aggroed, they'll try to slide into melee range so that they can use a cleave on you. Keep moving and stopping a short distance away until the pudding stops outside of melee range so that it can't use its cleave. The ranged attacks are a consistent source of damage that can't be kited, so be sure to Vercure or use a sustaining pot as necessary. Also, be aware that the ranged attacks can cancel your own casts. Deepi are a fairly straightforward enemy. They use a double auto attack every 15 seconds, and follow that up with Hypnotize, a sight mechanic with a very small frontal cone. Just keep in mind that double attacks from enemies on the 150s like the Deepi are slightly more brutal than their counterparts in the 140s. Gremlins are probably the easiest option on these floors. They'll inflict you with a stack of vulnerability, then follow up with a telegraphed AoE. Because they don't hit hard, the vulnerability doesn't end up being much of a problem, but it can be dangerous if other enemies are also aggroed. Pots are the toughest enemies on these early floors, but still aren't too tough. Because they're large and proximity based, it can be really hard to get past them without them aggroing. When engaged, they'll cast Mysterious Light, which is a very large sight mechanic. Look away or get blinded. After that cast, they'll begin using a ranged double attack every 12 seconds. They can output a pretty decent amount of damage, so I usually like to pop a sustaining potion while they're casting their sight mechanic to help deal with them. These floors are really straightforward, as none of the enemies are dangerous. However, pots hit pretty hard and can be easy to accidentally aggro, so keep an eye out for them in particular. Usually gremlins and Shabti are first on my list, followed by puddings, deep eyes, and finally pots, though you may be forced into fighting a few of them. Even for bad floor debuff combos, these early floors should still be easy enough to clear without using Serenity. Abaya are fairly similar to the Succubi from the last set, and are one of the easiest enemies to fight on these floors. They'll cast random AoEs when nearby but not aggroed, always before or during their movement. When aggroed, they'll just cast a telegraphed AoE and auto-attack. After a long period of time, they'll cast an attack buff on themselves, but it's unlikely that you'll ever see one survive long enough for this to happen. Devilets are pretty tough, and I usually try to avoid fighting them. They use ranged auto attacks, cast ice spikes that do a large amount of damage whenever you attack them with autos or weapon skills, and also cast Void Blizzard, which will inflict slow. This slow can be avoided by putting enough distance between yourself and the Devilet while it's casting. The best strategy for fighting one is to start running away, or use displacement as soon as you start to see it cast ice spikes. It'll cast Void Blizzard immediately after, but if you're far enough away at that point, you won't be hit by the slow. This strategy will also prevent you from auto-attacking the Devilet while its ice spikes are active. If you're able to avoid the slow, fighting them isn't too bad, but I still prefer fighting the other enemies that appear on these floors. Mariliths are the patrols for the middle of this floor set. They're big-bodied and aggro by proximity, so can be very hard to avoid and easy to accidentally aggro. Always keep an eye out for them when fighting other enemies. Personally, when I see one patrolling near me, I try to fight it as soon as possible, knowing that leaving it alive could cause problems for me later in the floor. They have a double auto attack that can certainly hurt, so you'll most likely want to use a sustaining pot while fighting them. They also have a telegraphed AoE that's easy to avoid. They usually use it right after their double attack. These floors are a little bit tougher than the early 150s, mostly due to Marilith patrols. Keep your head on a swivel for them, and avoid fighting Devilets, and there shouldn't be too many problems. Once again, I would say that these floors should be very clearable, even with a bad set of floor debuffs, so avoid using Serenity if possible. Soul Flayers are ranged casters with a few mechanics that can make them annoying to fight. I usually choose to fight them over Devilets, but otherwise prefer any other available targets over them. They have a basic telegraphed AoE that's easy to avoid, but they'll follow this up with a double auto attack that drains your health and restores their own. Between this and the ranged auto attack cast, they can do pretty significant damage and take a little bit longer to fight than most of the other enemies on this set. Along with Abayas, Taurus are by far the easiest enemies to fight on the late floors. They'll cast a telegraphed AoE around themselves that's easy to avoid, and just do normal auto attacks the rest of the time. Archdemons are the most dangerous enemy on this floor set. I've died to them at least a couple of times. Like Mariliths, they're big body patrols that aggro by proximity, so they'll be very hard to avoid. Once again, I usually fight these whenever they're nearby. Leaving them alive can bite you in the ass later. They'll open with a Telegraph Frontal Cone AoE, and we'll follow that up with Abyssal Transfixion, an extremely fast cast that'll paralyze you for 30 seconds. While you're paralyzed, keep a sustaining pot up and running, and heal yourself as necessary. During the paralysis, the Archdemon will use its Frontal Cone AoE again. If you end up being paralyzed in no man's land, getting hit by this AoE can kill you. The best way to deal with this is to fight directly in front of the demon and move forward as soon as it begins to cast the AoE, even if it means canceling your own cast. If you do this and keep up with your healing, they should be straightforward enough to handle. Pick off Archdemons as you see them. They're the most difficult, but leaving them alive can cause things to go downhill very fast. Otherwise, focus on killing Abayas and Taurus. If you need additional kills, I usually move on to fighting Soul Flayers and then Devilets last. If you find yourself having trouble with the Archdemons, don't be afraid to use a steal to help you gain some experience fighting them. Once again, it's better to live and progress than to die with unused Pomanders. These are the floors where I consider using a Serenity if hit with a bad combo of floor debuffs. Archdemons, Soul Flayers, and Devilets can all be very dangerous fights with Gloom, no items, and or maximum HP decreased. Todesritter is the boss for floor 160, and he can be a tough one. You've seen him before on floor 60, but this time his damage is less of a tickle and more of a knockout punch. I absolutely always use steel when fighting him, but strength and lust aren't as necessary. 8 minutes of steel should be enough time to defeat him without needing the extra damage from the other Poms. Of course, if you're running short on time and need to hurry up, strength and lust can be used to cut the fight down to just over 5 minutes long. Because of how hard he hits, it's extremely important to always have a sustaining pot running during this fight. If you let the HP regen effect drop, you'll need to use Vercure often to keep up with his damage, and every Vercure is both damage and time lost. If you're having trouble remembering to keep your sustaining pot rolling, it can be helpful to put it on a big ugly hotbar near the middle of your screen. However, if you really don't want to make your eyes bleed, do your best to remember to use it. Consider using Strength and Lust because the fight will get longer the more times you forget to keep your pots rolling. And be sure to use Lucid Dreaming when possible because MP will become an issue if you're using Vercure frequently. This boss is much simpler than the floor 150 boss, and there's only a few important mechanics to remember. The very first thing the boss will open with is its auto attack and double attack. He'll do this throughout the fight, so start rolling a sustaining pot and get used to that damage. Next, he'll use Hall of Sorrow, which will create a large circular puddle that'll inflict bleed if you stand inside of it. It's extremely important to move out of this puddle as soon as he places it. Ideally, you should already be on the move as he puts it down. The bleed effect does a significant amount of damage, and even taking just one tick of it will usually force you to Vercure to stay alive. After the puddle, the boss will summon 6 orbs around the edges of the room and use Valfoder, which will knock you backwards. If you're knocked into one of the AoEs surrounding the orbs, you'll take massive damage and die. However, there are always 2 sections around the outside of the room that don't spawn an orb. Put yourself between the boss and one of these safe sections, and he'll knock you back into it. Alternatively, you can use Surecast to completely prevent yourself from being knocked back, or you can aim for one of the small gaps between orbs if necessary, though I wouldn't suggest risking that unless you're already standing in the gap. That's the entire fight. The boss will just cycle between using his double attack and bleed puddles twice, then spawning orbs and knocking you back. Continue to keep the sustaining pots rolling, Vercure when necessary, keep moving to avoid the bleed puddles, and he'll go down soon enough. Out of all the floor sets that I cover in this walkthrough, 161 to 170 probably has the most boring and straightforward enemies, but that doesn't mean they aren't tough. Once again, they'll hit harder than the last set of floors, and the biggest threat is the large number of double auto attackers. For many of the enemies you fight on this set, including Mimics, you'll want to have a sustaining pot up and running and be kiting as much as possible, unless you're buffed with steel. Beyond the double auto attackers though, none of the other enemies have tough mechanics to deal with. Once again, you ideally want to be conserving Pomanders during this set, as all enemies can be fought without the help of buffs, and while time is starting to become a bit more of a concern, it still isn't very tough to manage at this point. Of course, my same advice holds here. If you're still actively working on progging through this set of floors, use Pomanders as needed. It's much better to reach the 170s and 180s with no Pomanders than it is to never reach them at all. Floor debuffs are rarer on this set than the previous one, but can be very dangerous when paired with some of the hard-hitting double attackers on this set. Any combination of Gloom, no items, and HP down is particularly dangerous. On floors with these debuffs, avoid fighting the double auto attackers, and consider using Steel or Serenity if you find yourself in a situation where you're absolutely forced to fight them. Otherwise, you'll have to be very efficient with your Vercures. I would probably at least use a Strength to increase the efficacy of Vercure if you want to preserve your Steel and Serenity for the later sets. As for the boss, you'll certainly want to be using Steel again, but I find this one doesn't hit as hard and is a little bit easier than the 160 boss. However, with only Steel, the boss fight takes about 7.5 minutes if you're efficient with your damage, so you might want to consider using a Strength or a Lust as well to ensure that the boss is dead before the Steel wears off. Lindworms are one of the best options to fight on these early floors. They have a Telegraph Frontal Cone AoE, and just do normal auto attacks otherwise. Similar to Lindworms, Sarcosuchus are another easy option. They also just use a Frontal Cone AoE, but this one is a bit larger. Tursus are the patrols for the early 160s, and one of the more annoying, though not particularly dangerous enemies that you'll encounter on this set. They'll open with a Telegraph Frontal Cone AoE, then follow that up with Ice Dispenser, an instant cast that inflicts slow. They don't do enough damage to be truly dangerous, but the slow certainly makes fighting them take a little longer than the other enemies on these floors. Like other enemies that inflict status effects, try fighting them one after another so that the duration of the slow effect is reduced each time. Crocs are the first and weakest of the double auto attackers on this set, but are still more dangerous than the other enemies listed before. Be ready to sustaining pot and kite if you end up fighting one, but because they're side aggro, you should be able to avoid them for the most part. Like Crocs, Wyvers are double auto attackers with no other mechanics. They'll just keep hitting you. However, they do more damage than Crocs and are big in proximity aggro, meaning that they're much harder to avoid. For some people, this is the first non-boss enemy they encounter where the amount of damage it outputs feels truly dangerous. Like Crocs, you'll want to use sustaining pots and have room to kite. Additionally, the Wyver is a good choice to start practicing Procure timing to offset the double attack, as it'll come in handy for all future double attackers that you encounter. Focus on picking off Lindworms, Sarcosuchus, and Tursus first and foremost. You'll also likely find yourself in situations where you have to fight Wyvers because they're in the way. They can be tough if you don't have much experience, but follow my tips for fighting them and you should be okay. If you don't feel comfortable dealing with their damage the first couple of times, don't be afraid to use steel to help make things easier. This advice applies for all the double attackers on this set of floors. As far as enchantments go, Gloom, HP down, or no items can make fighting Wyvers even tougher, but I still almost always avoid using Pomanders at this point. All the other enemies should be easy enough even with a bad set of debuffs. Mylodons are probably the first enemies in this section that you'll encounter. They often open with a Telegraph Frontal Cone AoE, and then follow up with a ranged double attack. Despite being named Slowball, this attack only does damage and doesn't actually inflict slow. The good news is that because they stop moving to use this attack, it usually won't occur at the same time as a normal auto attack, making it less dangerous than most double attacks. Regardless, they're still an enemy that you'll want to kite and use a sustaining pot or two against. There's no enemy more bullied in Palace than the patrol for the mid-160s, Fine Garoons. They'll open with a Telegraph Frontal Cone AoE. If you stand behind them during this time, they'll follow that up with a Conal AoE behind them. You can then continuously move out of this AoE and then back behind them, and they'll continue to use the same attack over and over. This means that they can be killed while taking almost no auto attack damage, making them quite possibly the easiest enemy to fight in all of the later floors combined. Archaeosaurs are the next double auto attackers that you'll run into, and they do even more damage than Wyvers. The good news is that they also have a Telegraph Circular AoE that they'll use centered around themselves, which should give you time to heal up after taking the double attack. However, I would still highly recommend fighting the non-double attacking enemies before taking on Archaeosaurs. These floors aren't too much worse than the early ones. You'll still likely run into situations where you find yourself having to fight Wyvers that are in the way. Otherwise, pick off any Vine Garoons and any Lindworms or Sarcosuchus that continue to appear, followed by Mylodons. In general, I'd consider Archaeosaurs a little easier to fight than Wyvers if you need some extra kills. They do quite a bit of damage, but they also give you some downtime to recover while casting their AoE. Once again, even if hit with bad debuffs, I try to avoid using Poms to deal with it on these floors, since most options are still easy enough to fight. Triceratops are literally Wyvers on steroids. They're big-bodied, proximity-based enemies that will often get in the way and force you to fight them. They have a double attack like the Wyvers, but do even more damage. They're still very doable without steel, but you'll definitely want to use sustaining pots, have a lot of room to kite, and have some well-timed procures when taking them on. Pteranodons are the patrols for the late 160s. They're fairly big in proximity aggro, making them hard to avoid, especially as patrols. I usually fight these guys as soon as I see them. They'll use a Telegraph Circular AoE, and normal auto attacks otherwise. The cast time on their AoE is a bit faster than normal compared to others in Palace. I've been hit by this way more times than I'd like to admit. Keep that in mind when fighting them. Getting hit by it won't kill you if you're at full HP, but it'll certainly hurt a lot. Diplocaulus are the most annoying enemy to fight on the set. They'll cast Mucin, which will make them impervious to all damage for a short period of time. Additionally, they'll use a sight based on Telegraph Frontal Cone AoE called Foregone Gleam. Move to the sides or look away. Beyond this, they'll do normal auto attacks, and because they use Foregone Gleam pretty frequently, they don't do much damage and aren't particularly dangerous as a result. Triceratops are not an enemy that you should be looking to fight, but chances are that you'll be forced to take on at least a couple because of how easy it is for them to get in the way. A bad floor debuff combo is especially dangerous when fighting these guys, so these are the floors where you may want to use a Steel, Serenity, or even Strength for the extra Vercure potency. Other than that, snipe out Pteranodons and Diplocaulus to open up the way to the floor 170 boss. The boss for 170 is Yalungu. Once again, you've already seen the mechanics from its appearance as the floor 70 boss, but this time it hits much harder. The good news is that the damage is more manageable than the 160 boss, though you'll still absolutely want to be using Steel for this fight. The fight takes 7.5 minutes with just Steel, assuming that you keep your sustaining pot rolling and output damage at a good pace. If you aren't comfortable fighting this boss, you'll want to use either a Strength or Lust to ensure that you take down the boss within the 8-minute duration of the Steel. If time is a problem, with both Strength and Lust, you can finish the fight in under 5.5 minutes. Once again, it's highly recommended to always keep a sustaining pot rolling during this fight. While the damage isn't quite as much as the last boss, it's still high enough to where you'll have to Vercure to make up for any healing that you miss by not keeping your pots rolling. This boss also only has a few mechanics to remember. It'll open with auto attacks and a cleave, use a telegraphed AoE called Electrogenesis, and then cast Douse, which will place a circular puddle on the boss that grants it increased attack damage and haste. As soon as it places the puddle, be sure to kite it outside so that it loses these buffs, otherwise you'll start to take massive damage and die very quickly. I highly recommend always fighting this boss around the edges of the room and not kiting it during a majority of the fight. Instead, face tank it until it uses Douse, and then move 90 degrees or so around the edge of the room to kite it out of the puddle. This is because there can be up to 3 Douse puddles active at the same time, so using this strategy will allow you to manage the positioning of the puddles neatly, and ensure there's always plenty of room to fight the boss. After dousing for the first time, the boss will inflict you with heavy for 15 seconds, then hit you with its cleave. When there's about 3 seconds left on the heavy effect, it'll use Electrogenesis again. To avoid the AoE, you'll have to either use Displacement, or start sprinting when there's around 5 seconds remaining on the heavy debuff. After that, it'll once again cast Douse, and this cycle will repeat. Because of the duration reduction, you won't need to worry about the heavy during Electrogenesis again until the 6th cycle, when the duration reduction will reset, and you'll be hit with the full duration of 15 seconds again. Remember to keep the sustaining pots rolling, Vercure when necessary, move the boss out of its Douse puddles, and keep either Displacement or Sprint available whenever you're hit with the full duration of the heavy effect. If you do all that, this boss shouldn't be too much of a problem. I definitely consider it easier than the previous one. Next up is the 170s. This is where the difficulty in Palace really begins to ramp up. Enemies continue to hit harder, and there are a number that have some pretty tough mechanics compared to the 160s. In particular, you'll run into 2 enemies that use dots on this floor set, Wolves and Anzus. Both should be avoided as much as possible. The biggest nightmare on this set are the Sasquatches though, extremely large proximity aggro double attackers that can't be fought entirely safely without Steel. At this point, Mimics can also start to be extremely dangerous if fighting them with debuffs. Always make sure you have room to kite and sustaining pots ready to go. You'll want to continue conserving your resources for the most part on this set, but staying alive and finishing within an hour becomes very difficult without the usage of at least some palms. In particular, being conservative with your usage of Steel, Flight, Serenity, and Rage is extremely important during this set, as these are the palms that'll carry you through the 180s and 190s. However, you'll start to encounter a couple of the first enemies which cannot be fought without Steel, and you might find that time is an issue unless you use a Flight and/or Rage to get through the later floors in this set. Also, this is the first set where I personally always use Erasing. There's plenty of ways to die, especially when trying to conserve other palms, so having the second chance available is often a literal lifesaver. Floor debuffs aren't too much of a problem on the early floors, but can become absolutely brutal on the later ones. In particular, having a no items debuff can be extremely problematic, especially if you don't have Steel running and are forced into fighting a Sasquatch. Because of this, there will be situations where there's no other options other than to use a Serenity, but ideally try to find a way to fight through it unless it's truly impossible. Once again, these no-win Serenity situations become even more common on floors after this set. For most jobs, the 180 boss is the single greatest challenge in Palace. However, as a red mage, it's not a super tough fight as long as you know what to expect going into it. In fact, this boss does much less damage than the previous two bosses, so you can fight him without any poms if you have enough time. It's rare to have enough time for this to be a possibility, but it can be extremely valuable to enter the 180s with an extra strength and steel. However, even if you have the time, I'd recommend using strength and steel if it's one of your first times fighting him. Wait until you have some experience before attempting him without poms. Bears are the easiest enemy to fight in the early 170s. They have a telegraph frontal cone AoE that they'll use fairly frequently, and otherwise only do normal auto attacks. Dommels are also one of the easier options available. Similar to the bear, they'll use a telegraph frontal cone AoE, but they don't use it quite as frequently. Additionally, they'll cast Whistle after about 20 seconds, which will give them a damage buff. However, they'll usually be dead or very close to dead by the time they cast this, so very rarely does it actually become an issue. Snowclops are the patrol enemy for the early 170s. For the most part, they alternate between using two different untelegraphed AoEs. The first is Glower, which covers a long line directly in front of the Snowclops, while the other is a 100-ton swing, which is a large circular AoE. Navigate to the sides when it casts Glower, then move far away for the 100-ton swing. They'll usually try to sneak in a couple auto attacks between AoEs, but because they spend most of their time casting, they generally don't do a dangerous amount of auto attack damage. The first double attacker you'll encounter on this floor set is the Bandersnatch. It has no other mechanics, so it'll just auto attack and hit you with double attacks periodically. While it certainly hurts to fight, they're doable without steel. However, because there's plenty of better options to fight on these floors, I'd highly recommend avoiding them as much as possible. Wolves are the first enemy that you'll encounter in Palace that you absolutely do not want to fight without steel. They're one of the rare enemies that fall under the dot category. They'll inflict a potent frostbite. If that doesn't sound bad enough, the double auto attack that inflicts the frostbite will also drain your HP and restore their own. If you have steel running, the potency of the dot actually lines up pretty evenly with the amount of HP that is restored by sustaining pots, meaning that the wolves become very doable at that point. The problem is that you absolutely don't want to be using a steel this early in the 170s unless you get one for free, and because the wolves restore their own HP, fighting them takes a little longer than the other enemies that you'll find on these floors. Because of this, avoid them at all costs. I only fight them if I happen to have a free steel buff running and need some additional kills to open the exit. Focus on Dommels, Bears, and Snowclops while avoiding Bandersnatches and Wolves. If you absolutely need additional kills, fight Bandersnatches. At this point, floor debuffs shouldn't be an issue. There's enough options that are easy enough to kill even with a bad debuff combination. You'll want to be able to preserve your palm economy on these floors, just as you have in the earlier floor sets. Wisents, the patrol for the mid-170s, seem deceptively straightforward for the first 30 seconds of the fight. They'll spend that time hitting you with auto attacks over and over again, which can actually hurt quite a bit and force you to Vercure once or twice in addition to sustaining pots if you don't have steel up. However, after 30 seconds, Wisents become extremely dangerous. They'll suck you into them, apply a very strong heavy debuff, and then use a massive AoE that'll damage you for almost 70% of your health and apply paralysis. With strength, you should be able to kill them before they reach this enrage. Without strength, but with a full meter and all abilities off cooldown, you can often just barely squeeze out enough damage in time to kill them. Otherwise, take note of when you pull them, and if it doesn't seem like they're going to die in time, surecast, disengage, and start sprinting just before the 30-second mark. This will allow you to avoid the suction and the follow-up AoE. In fact, even if you don't surecast in time, you might be able to use displacement after the suction effect, and still have just enough time to run outside the AoE. If you won't make it out in time, make sure that your health is at 100% and that you time a Vercure for immediately after the AoE damage hits you. Also, pay attention if you have pox or if there's any floor debuffs. If there's gloom, damage down, blind, no items, or abilities unavailable, the Wisent won't die quite as fast as you would normally expect, and you may have to keep an eye on the timer and be ready to deal with the enrage. Lions are a tough option available on these floors if you don't have steel running, but an option nonetheless. They'll open with a double auto attack that hurts like hell, but then use a large telegraphed AoE centered around themselves that should give you plenty of time to recover. The biggest issue is after this AoE, where there will be a fairly long period of auto and double attacks before they use the AoE again. Be sure to Sustaining Pot, for Cure, and Kite during this time to stay alive. Sasquatches are the next nightmare you'll encounter in the 170s. Big-bodied and proximity aggro means it's very likely that they'll get in your way and force you to fight them. The problem is that they're double auto attackers that do enough damage to where it's only 100% safe to fight them with steel active. They can be fought without steel, but it requires constant Sustaining Pot uptime, on-point kiting, and extremely well-timed cures. The scariest part is that if they land a crit with both their auto attack and their double attack at the same time, you'll die even at full HP without steel. Because of this, fighting them without steel relies on not getting unlucky, or your ability to stagger their auto and double attack, which even if you have a lot of experience doing, is not a particularly easy or reliable thing to pull off. Additionally, you'll probably want to at least be using strength to increase your Vercure potency and to decrease the duration of the fight and the chances of you making a mistake or getting unlucky. As a result, I highly suggest using steel to fight them unless you have a lot of experience and confidence in yourself. Sasquatches are a big problem even outside of combat as well. First, they'll occasionally cast Ripe Banana, which will increase their damage. Don't pull them while this buff is active. After Ripe Banana, they'll use Chest Thump 4 times, which deals AoE damage and gives a vulnerability stack to anyone within a radius of about 1 room over. When fighting other enemies, be sure to do it outside the range of any Sasquatches that could place a vulnerability stack on you. Otherwise, normally doable enemies can become extremely dangerous. First, pick off any remaining Bear, Dommel, or even Bandersnatch spawns. Besides those, Wissens and Lions can both be fought without steel. Be sure to fight all enemies out of the range of any Sasquatches that could start using Chest Thump. These guys will be your biggest issue. Because of their massive size and proximity-based aggro, you may find situations where you have to fight them. As mentioned before, if you feel extremely confident in yourself, you can try to take them on without steel, though I would at least recommend using strength. Otherwise, absolutely use steel to fight them. At this point, floor debuffs can really start to screw you over. If you get a no items floor and don't already have steel running, Sasquatches become virtually impossible to fight. Use a Serenity if you find yourself in an absolute no-win situation like that, but once again, if there's any way to fight through it, try your hardest to do so. Other than these scenarios where you're forced to use steel or Serenity, continue to hold on to your Pomanders. While not the most dangerous enemy, Curls are a long and annoying fight. They'll usually open with a telegraphed frontal cone AoE, and then paralyze you for 30 seconds. Besides that, they'll just hit you with normal auto attacks. The good news is that they only auto attack and don't use their AoE while you're paralyzed. Even though they are doable without steel, I usually prioritize lions and birds before them because the paralysis can make fights with Curls drag on for quite a long time. Because of the length of the status effect, fighting Curls one after another for the duration reduction is highly advised. The last nightmare of the 170s is the Anzu. Anzus are weapons of mass destruction. Do not fight them. They inflict a potent windburn dot shortly after being engaged, and follow that up with a move called Flying Frenzy, a body slam that'll inflict you with vulnerability up and stun you for a few seconds. They'll then continue to spam Flying Frenzy every 15 seconds and reapply their dot until one of you are dead, and it's usually going to be you. If you have strength, steel, no pox, and no floor debuffs, they're doable. But let me be clear, the only reason I've fought Anzus was for the purpose of this guide. On my own serious clear attempts, I never even consider fighting them, so I suggest you do the same. The patrol for the late 170s is the Bird. It'll open with a double auto attack called Phyloplumes, and follow it up with a small telegraphed AoE called Revelation. After using Phyloplumes a second time, the Bird will cast Tropical Wind to give itself a haste and damage buff. During this time, it will mostly spam cast Revelation, but if you stand in front of it between casts, it'll hit you with an auto attack that'll do massive damage. Instead, keep your distance and avoid the AoEs, or if you only have a tight space to work with, you can stand directly behind the Bird while it casts an AoE. It'll turn around, but it won't auto attack you before casting its next one. Along with Lions, these are the best option available if fighting without steel. The number of viable options for non-steel users becomes even smaller on these floors. Focus on Lions and Birds first, then Curls, and finally Sasquatches if you feel really comfortable fighting them without steel. Anzus, even with strength and steel, shouldn't be considered an option, since every other enemy on these floors is much less dangerous. At this point, there's a good chance that you'll find yourself running low on time, and you may need to use a flight or rage to speed up your progress through these late floors. Your steel economy might be a good way to determine which one you should use. If you have 3 steels and you run into a tough situation, you can use one and then pair it with a flight so that you can clear the next floor and possibly even some of the next one during the steel's uptime. If you are already low on steel and see a situation where you would normally need one, it can be a good idea to clear as much of the floor as possible, use a rage to finish off the tough part, and carry the rage onto the next floor to clear it as well. These are the first floors where this strategy becomes extremely valuable, and it continues to apply to the 180s and 190s. As for enchantments, the same advice for the mid-170s applies for these floors as well. The biggest issue will continue to be floors with no items where you're forced into fighting Sasquatches. Use a Serenity if necessary. The 180 boss is Dendane Sohn, more commonly known as Behemoth. For most jobs, this is the boss that makes you lose sleep at night. Luckily, Red Mage isn't most jobs. As usual, you've seen the mechanics before on the floor 80 iteration of this boss, but it hits harder this time. With Strength, Steel, and Lust, this boss will take about 6.5 minutes. However, it doesn't have a double attack or a cleave, so this is the one boss beyond 150 that is very doable without steel. You'll just have to be careful to use Vercure often to keep your HP well above half, because auto attack crits can do nearly 10k damage. As it can be done without steel, then that also means that Lust and Strength aren't necessary as long as you have enough time left. If you fight the boss without any of these 3 palms, you'll want to make sure that you have at least 11 minutes to work with. Because of the difficulty of the next set of floors, entering them with an additional Strength, Lust, and especially Steel can be game-changing. However, I would only recommend not using Steel if you already have a lot of experience fighting this boss. There's a lot to keep in mind during this fight, so if it's one of your first times doing it, you don't want to have to focus too much on Vercuring to keep your HP up. And as usual, you'll want to keep your sustaining pot rolling throughout the boss fight, even if you do have Steel running. There are 3 mechanics to be aware of throughout the first 85% of the fight. The first is a large frontal cone AoE called Thunderbolt. Keep your distance from the boss, and you should have no trouble dodging this. The second mechanic is Charybdis, which places a tornado that'll continuously use an AoE on its position. Note that the AoE of the initial cast is slightly smaller than the size of the AoE casted by the tornado, so move even further out of the way after the tornado spawns. The third and final mechanic is Trounce. Behemoth will move to the edge of the room and cast a conal AoE in your direction that'll extend across the entire arena. Stay close to him, or you won't be able to avoid it. You can use Korokor to close any distance between you and the boss, and then run to the side to avoid the AoE. Behemoth will first use this at the bottom of the arena, where you spawn initially, and then at the top of the arena, where he spawns initially, and alternate between those 2 positions. If you keep that in mind, you can always position yourself so that you're nearby whenever Behemoth uses Trounce. Behemoth will use these 3 mechanics in this exact order: Thunderbolt, Charybdis twice, Thunderbolt, and then Trounce at the bottom of the arena. Charybdis twice, Thunderbolt, Charybdis once more, and then Trounce at the top of the arena. This cycle will then continue to repeat until he drops below 15% HP. I like to move this boss around the edges of the room in a clockwise motion. I'll place the first 2 Charybdis tornadoes along the right edge, moving towards the bottom of the room to prepare for Trounce, and then place a set of 3 tornadoes along the left edge as I move up the side towards the top of the room for the next Trounce. When the boss drops below 15% HP, that's when things get really interesting. He'll begin casting Ecliptic Meteor constantly, an attack which will do damage equal to 80% of your total HP every 9 seconds. As a red mage with Vercure, this damage is manageable. Keep your sustaining pot rolling throughout this phase, and follow a pattern of Vercure into either Ver Arrow or Ver Thunder. That'll result in 2 Vercures between each meteor, which should be enough healing to keep you alive. If you don't have strength running, you might possibly have to throw in a 3rd Vercure every once in a while. There's a couple other things to keep in mind during this phase. Don't stand in front of the boss. He won't move while raining down meteors, but he will auto-attack you between casts if you're standing in front of him. Be sure to use Lucid Dreaming throughout the entire fight, but especially during this last portion. Using Vercure frequently will eat through your MP quickly, so you'll definitely need the extra MP to stay alive throughout the meteor phase. Finally, continue to use your damage dealing OGCDs as normal, but I would recommend not using the melee combo. Stick to the Vercure and Verthunder Verarrow cast to make sure you get through this phase safely. Survive through the meteors, and you're one step closer to Necromancer status. Now it's time for the toughest challenge of all, the 180s. This is an absolutely brutal set of floors for even the best of runners. There's a large number of extremely dangerous enemies, time is a massive concern, and the boss is an absolute nightmare. However, despite all of this, it can be done, so don't lose hope. This is the set of floors that you've been conserving Pomanders in preparation for. Going into this set, you should ideally still have 2 or 3 of all your Pomanders, but by the end of this set, you'll probably have used a majority of the more useful ones. In particular, your usage of Steel, Rage, Flight, and Serenity on this set are what will make or break you. The mid and late floors of this set are especially brutal because there's almost no enemies that can be fought without Steel, so you'll most likely want to be using Flights and Rages on a majority of them. Possibly one of the only good things about this floor set is that Mimics are still very doable without Steel, as long as you have room to kite and there's no bad debuffs active. This makes them a better option than most of the normal mobs on this set. If you still have Raising Pomanders, absolutely use one now. I've died far more on the 180s than any other set of floors. Floor debuffs are absolutely deadly at this point. A no items debuff alone is usually enough to force the usage of a Serenity. Fighting even the easier enemies without the help of sustaining potions is insanely difficult and time consuming, and when paired with Gloom, HP down, or no abilities, difficult quickly turns into impossible. Because of this, you're almost guaranteed to encounter at least a floor or two that'll absolutely require a Serenity, which is why it's so important to hold on to them until you're forced into using them on these unwinnable debuff floors. The 190 boss is by far the toughest boss for Red Mage. Because of how hard the boss hits, having Steel running the entire time you fight is an absolute necessity, and you'll want to use a Strength and at least one Lust to ensure that you're able to defeat the boss within the 8 minutes of Steel uptime. Also, before fighting this boss, it's a good idea to remember the positions of the adds that spawn throughout the fight. I'll cover them once we get to that point. One of the 2 patrols that you'll find in the early 180s is the Womora. They have a large telegraph frontal cone AoE, and will use normal auto attacks otherwise. These are one of the few enemies in the 180s that can be done comfortably without Steel, so be sure to take advantage of any that spawn. Garms are the other patrol that you'll find in the early 180s. However, unlike other enemies, these guys will spawn throughout all 9 floors, and they're absolutely massive in proximity aggro, so be prepared to fight them a lot. The good news is that because they use a large number of AoEs, they're another one of the few enemies that can be fought without Steel, but the bad news is that if you lose concentration when fighting them, you'll quickly find yourself dead. They have a variety of telegraph frontal cone AoEs that they'll use, but their 2 most dangerous attacks are both untelegraphed. The first is Ram's Voice, which is a circular AoE centered on the Garm itself. When you see this being casted, run away. The other is Dragon's Voice, which is a massive donut AoE centered on the Garm. When you see this, run inside the Garm. Just remember, Ram's Voice out, Dragon's Voice in. Grenades are another one of the easiest options to fight on this floor set. They'll use a telegraph circular AoE centered on themselves, and auto-attack normally the rest of the time. Like Womora's, these can be done no problem without Steel. Sprites are ranged casters with no other mechanics. They'll just consistently output auto-attack damage. Because of this, they can be fought without Steel, but it takes absurdly long due to the amount of time you'll have to spend using Vercure. Whenever I have to fight one without Steel, I'll usually use a Strength to speed up the fight significantly. Also, it's worth noting that sprites are sight-based aggro, but until recently, you couldn't tell which way they were facing until they moved. However, now that enemies have an arrow to display their orientation, it's now very easy to avoid sprites as necessary. Womora Kampa are one of the rare enemies with a ranged double attack, and otherwise only use normal autos. While they're doable without Steel, you'll want to have a lot of room to kite, and be smart with your Vercure usage to help deal with the double attack. Your approach for the early 180s should be similar to that of the early 170s. Save your Pomanders, but keep in mind that time is a huge problem with this floor set, so be very efficient with your target selection. Wamoras, grenades, and Garms are all straightforward without steel. If you need more kills after all of those are dead, I usually prefer to fight Wamora Kampas over sprites as long as I have room to kite. If you're dangerously low on steel, flight, serenity, or rage palms, now is a good time to start using affluence. However, if you can wait, it might be better to hold off until the mid 180s so that you can pair it with some flights. Floor debuffs can usually be fought through on these early floors, but it can still be very dangerous, especially if the debuff is no items. Do your best to hold on to your serenities and steel, but if there's a bad debuff combo, then you might need to use one or the other, if forced into fighting some of the tougher enemies such as Wamora Kampas. Being sound-based means that crawlers are easy to avoid, and you'll definitely want to do so. Shortly after being aggroed, these guys will hit you with a double attack that also inflicts a 30-second slow, and then follow up with a poison dot. Similar to the wolves in the 170s, the dot seems to match up pretty evenly with the healing from a sustaining pod if you have steel active, so you'll have to Vercure to keep up with their auto attack damage. When either of these effects drop, they'll reapply them immediately. Like Anzus, you should absolutely not be fighting these guys, but if you have to, steel is a must for survival, and strength is highly recommended, otherwise it's an extremely long fight. Worms are a tough enemy, and because they're also sound-based, I almost always avoid fighting them. Similar to Garms, they're unique in that they can appear on every floor in this set, though they don't start showing up frequently until these middle floors. They're similar to Wamora Kampas in that they'll use a ranged double attack, but they do more damage, so you need to have steel up when dealing with them. Additionally, if not killed within 30 seconds, they have an enrage similar to the Wissen on the 170s, where they'll suck you in and use a brutal AoE. If you're at full health, have steel up, and the attack doesn't crit, it's possible to survive, but it's best not to take that risk. Instead, just before the 30-second mark, use Surecast and Displacement and start running. It's worth keeping in mind that the telegraphed AoE that appears is for the suction effect and not the follow-up AoE, which has a smaller radius. If you have Surecast active, then you can stand within the edge of the telegraph and not have to worry about getting hit with the massive damage. If dealing with their enrage wasn't bad enough, Worms will also hit you with random ranged auto attacks when not aggroed. The range is similar to the chest thump of Sasquatches, about one room away. Always stay a large distance away from Worms when fighting other enemies. Vinthers are the patrols that appear in the mid-180s and aggro based off of proximity. They'll alternate between spamming two telegraph circular AoEs, one centered on you and one centered on them. Because they spend so much time using these AoEs, they do virtually no auto attack damage and are therefore the easiest enemy on this entire floor set. Archaeosaurs are double attackers that begin appearing in the mid-180s. Interestingly, these guys are identical to the Archaeosaurs in the mid-160s, except they do more damage and look completely different visually. After double attacking the first time, they'll stop and cast a telegraphed AoE, giving you some time to recover from the double attack. They do enough damage with the double and auto attacks to where I'd recommend only fighting them with steel, though they are doable with strength, room to kite, and good Vercure timing. This is when the set starts to get really ugly. I almost always try to avoid fighting crawlers and worms. Luckily, since they both aggro based on sound, they're usually pretty easy to dodge. The patrols are the lifesavers for these floors because they can both be fought without steel. I usually try not to use any palms for 184, since between patrols and leftover spawns from the first group of enemies, there's sometimes enough kills available without needing to burn any resources. However, from that point on, using steel, flight, or rage almost becomes a necessity to continue to clear floors. If I'm able to clear out a portion of a floor, but need to use a steel to finish off the last few enemies, I'll pair it with strength and flight so that I can also complete the next floor, and possibly even a portion of a third floor during the steel's uptime. If forced into using a steel and fighting the tougher enemies, I like to prioritize Archaeosaurs first, then worms, and finally crawlers last. If flighting, it can also be a good idea to use any affluences that you have left alongside your flights. Another good option at this point is to start considering using alteration. I personally prefer to use at least 2 of them in the early 190s, but because mimics are fightable without steel on the 180s as long as you aren't hit with floor debuffs, using an alteration at this point will guarantee you at least one room full of enemies to fight. Of course, don't use an alteration if you're also using a flight on the same floor. As for Rage, I usually prefer to save them for the late 180s, but it may be a good idea to use one on these middle floors if you're running behind on time or encounter a floor with no good options to fight. If you do use a Rage at this point, you'll definitely want to try and utilize it across 2 floors. Get as many safe kills as you can on the first floor, use the Rage to gather the rest of the needed kills, then exit with the Rage still active, and get as many kills with it on the next floor as possible. Finally, this is the point at which enchantments can very easily make a floor impossible to clear without using a Serenity. In particular, if you get a no items floor, you'll almost certainly have to use a Serenity at this point. If you get a floor with a bad debuff combo but items enabled, you can opt to use a Rage instead to clear the floor. Of course, this is essentially trading one extremely important Pomander for another arguably more important one, so I would only do so if low on Serenity, or if it's an ideal Rage situation regardless of the enchantments. Claws can be fought with Steel, but it's a long and annoying fight unless you have good timing. Shortly after being pulled, it'll suck you in and hit you with a double attack, and then cast Tail Screw, which will inflict slow for 20 seconds. However, if you use displacement and run away at the right time, you'll be able to avoid the slow, making the fight much faster and easier. After being sucked in, you'll want to wait a second after the claw auto-attacks you once, then use displacement and run. Time it right, and the claw isn't too much of a problem, although there's a good chance you won't be able to kill it fast enough before it attempts to slow you again. The Flood Dragon is the king of all palace mobs. You should not be fighting this enemy under any circumstances. It has a double attack that inflicts a potent frostbite dot that it'll use frequently, as well as a telegraph circular AoE called Granite Rain. Between the dot and double attack, the dragon does a massive amount of damage. It's doable with Strength, Steel, and a Death Wish, but know that I sure as hell don't try to fight them on my runs. The mid 180s are tough, but things only get worse on these floors. It's worth noting that there's no new patrol for the late 180s. Instead, the Garm is the only patrol that'll spawn. The Garm's also the only normal mob that can be fought without Steel on these floors, meaning that you'll have to continue to rely heavily on Poms to be able to progress. As mentioned before, while I often find myself using Steel in flights on the mid 180s, I try to save my Rages for these late floors because of the smaller number of options that are available to fight without Steel, and because the enemies on these floors can still be tough to fight even with Steel. However, if you still have Steel in flight at this point, you can certainly continue to utilize those instead of Rage. Just keep in mind that you'll need to save at least one Steel for fighting the boss on 190. If fighting enemies with Steel, I prioritize Archaeosaurs first if I'm lucky to have any spawn, then Claws and Worms next. Absolutely avoid fighting dragons under any circumstances. As with the mid 180s, Alteration can still be a very good option for providing yourself with a room full of enemies to fight, but if you're running without Steel, then the only options will still just be the inhabitants of that room, Garms, and any additional mimics you find, which usually still won't be enough to open the exit. At the very least, this will allow you to get most of the progress towards the exit and finish things off with a Steel or Rage. Once again, if using a Rage, you'll usually want to try to extend it across 2 floors to get the most value out of it. If you have to Rage at the beginning of a floor and won't have enough time left on the transformation to carry it to the next one, be sure to at least use a Fortune and get as many chests as possible. At the same time, be aware of how much time you have remaining. If you're running low on time, you might have to actually avoid opening chests in case they happen to be a mimic. The strategy for Serenity doesn't change much between the mid 180s and these floors. A no items debuff is pretty much an instant Serenity, as well as any bad combo of Gloom, HP down, and abilities disabled if you aren't planning on using a Rage. The 190 boss is the Godfather. This is the most challenging boss by far for a red mage. As with the past few bosses, you've seen the mechanics already on floor 90, but this time around the boss does absolutely insane damage. You'll absolutely need Steel throughout the entire fight. To make things worse, you also have to commit a Strength and at least one Lust to finish the fight within the 8-minute Steel duration. There's no bosses after this one, so you should use all the Lusts that you have remaining in your inventory to make the fight as short as possible. As usual, you'll need to keep your sustaining pot rolling throughout this entire fight. This fight also requires that you use Vercure frequently because of the high overall damage inflicted by the boss. Use Lucid Dreaming as necessary to keep your MP at a healthy level. Right at the start, the boss will use its Cleave. This Cleave does a massive amount of damage. You'll need to remember at which points during the fight the boss uses it, so that you can use Vercure to offset the damage immediately, otherwise you'll die quickly to follow up auto attacks. Shortly after, a set of blue bomb ads will spawn. You need to kill the big bomb before it finishes casting hypothermal combustion. Be sure to pay attention to the positions of the little bombs as well. They'll use an AoE shortly after spawning that is telegraphed so quickly that you won't be able to react to it, so just stay far away from them. While fighting the bomb, the boss will use Sap, a telegraphed AoE, so be sure to avoid it. Once the bomb is taken care of, the boss will then use Sap twice more. Now is the best time to use Lust and place 5 stacks of vulnerability on the boss, since you won't be taking much damage while it's casting Sap. After the Sap spam, the boss will use its Cleave again, Time of Vercure to deal with the damage. Following the Cleave, the boss will use Sap one last time, then the second set of bomb ads will spawn. This time, the big bomb will be orange, and you'll need to position it on top of the boss to stop it from casting Massive Burst. You can push the bomb to the necessary position by attacking it, but they spawn in the same positions each fight, so it's easier to memorize where they'll spawn beforehand, and pre-position the boss directly on top of it. Here's a graphic, courtesy of Toto from Angelus's Discord, that shows the positions. The big blue bomb from the first set of ads also spawns in the same spots, but it's not particularly important to remember its positions, only the ones for the orange bomb. If having trouble remembering the exact spawn location, just know that you can position the boss in the same spot for the first 3 cycles and the 5th cycle, to the right of the middle of the room, and the opposite for the 4th cycle, which will be to the left of the middle of the room. If still fighting the boss on the 6th cycle, position the boss near the top of the room. While the bomb is positioned on the boss, remember to avoid using Contra 6, as it'll push the bomb away. I've made this mistake on several occasions. However, if you do accidentally push it away, or aren't able to get the orange bomb onto the boss, don't panic too much, as you can survive Massive Burst. It'll do damage equal to 99% of your total HP, so make sure you're completely topped off before the cast finishes, put as much distance between you and the boss as possible, and then immediately start spamming Vercure to get your health back up. After Massive Burst finishes, whether it's cancelled or not, the boss will begin the cycle again with its first Cleave. Before the vulnerability wears off during the 2nd cycle, the easiest way to refresh it is to hit the boss with a single Void Fire to reset the timer on all 5 stacks. If you forget to do it before the vulnerability wears off, it's fine to wait until the boss double saps again to put all 5 stacks back on. In short, keep track of which cycle you're on so you remember where the orange bomb ad will spawn, time your Vercures to deal with the Cleaves, use your Lusts at the right time, and stay far away from the small bomb ads. Accomplish all of that, and you'll be on your way to the final floor set. The good news is that the 190s aren't as tough as the 180s. The bad news is that it's still a pretty nasty set, and you're probably extremely low on Pomanders at this point. Similar to the 160s, there's a large number of double attacking enemies on these floors, but this time they do enough damage to where you need Steel Active to fight any of them. To make matters worse, Mimics appear at a high rate and are extremely hard to fight without the help of Pomanders. At the very least, you'll want to have Strength active and be extremely good at kiting and Vercuring to take one on without Steel. Because of all of this, the number of Pomanders you're able to preserve through the 180s is often what determines the outcome of this set of floors. In particular, the 4 most important Pomanders are still as game-changing as ever. As mentioned before, there's a large number of double attacking enemies that require Steel to be fought normally, and by the later floors, there's almost no options available that don't fall under this group. Flight can be especially helpful for the last few floors because they spawn more enemies than normal. As always, Rage is fantastic for saving time and clearing out floors without needing Steel. However, even if you enter this floor with none of these Pomanders, this floor set is still doable, so don't be discouraged regardless of how bad your Pomander economy is. All it takes is a few lucky drops from chests, and you're back in business. Also, at this point, you'll most likely have restocked on Resolution Pomanders, which can be extremely helpful for this floor set because a majority of the enemies are considered undead. You'll need to hit enemies 3 times with Heavenly Judge to kill them, and you won't want to use it on most of the double attackers if you don't have Steel running, because they can kill you almost instantly if they get a couple lucky crits. However, even without Steel, there are a number of stunnable and non-double attacking enemies that you can clear out with it for some quick and easy kills. Once again, Floor debuffs can be brutal, so the number of serenities that you have available can often be the difference between a clear and a duty failed. No items available is still an absolute serenity, and Gloom with HP down can make fighting double attackers extremely dangerous even with steal. The good news is that there's no boss to fight at the end, so you'll only need to have about a minute left when entering floor 200, instead of the usual minimum of 6 to 8 minutes. However, time can still be a serious problem, meaning that you may have to consider using serenities on floors with debuffs that slow you down significantly, such as Gloom and abilities unavailable. Traps are by far the easiest enemy to fight in this entire set. They'll stay far away from you and use ranged auto attacks, but these come at an extremely slow pace, so they do a very low amount of damage compared to other mobs on this floor set. Stay out of melee range, because they'll hit you with normal auto attacks if you come close enough, at which point they actually become quite dangerous. Additionally, if close enough, they'll also use a frontal cone AoE. Hippogriffs are the first of the double attacking enemies that you'll encounter on these floors. They should not be fought without steal. Along with their double attack, they also have a normal circular AoE that you've probably come to expect from hippogriffs by this point. The good news is that they aggro based on sight in the 190s, unlike some of their earlier counterparts, so they can be avoided when steal isn't up and running. Iron courses are an absolute nightmare. They're big, proximity aggro patrols that cannot be fought without steal as a red mage. If they aggro, they'll use a gap closer immediately and usually hit you with an auto attack at the same time, the combination of which can kill you instantly if you get unlucky with crits and don't have steal up and running. Even if you survive the initial engagement without steal, you won't survive the ensuing fight, as they'll continue to use the gap closer periodically. As a result, your only option after an accidental aggro is to pray that you live to heal through the gap closer and immediately use a witching, steal, or take a death. After traps, mummies are your next best option on these floors when fighting without steal. They'll frequently use a frontal cone AoE, which should give you time to recover from their auto attacks. However, they still do significant damage, and you'll want plenty of room to kite and be ready to procure and use sustaining pots when fighting them without steal. In my opinion, these early floors are by far the worst part of this set. Because traps and mummies are very doable without steal, there are usually plenty of kills available to open the exit on these floors, and you'll want to try to avoid using any of the important Pomanders you have left over from the 180s. However, the Iron Course patrols have to be completely avoided since they'll destroy you if you don't have steal running. This means that you'll probably have to spend a lot of time waiting for patrols to pass as you pick fights with traps and mummies. As a result, it's not uncommon for these first 3 floors to take up to 30 minutes, so don't force yourself into making mistakes by panicking too much about time. As for other Pomanders, if you still have any affluence left, use them immediately. It can also be a good idea to use any fortunes you have left to try and fish for an extra chest or 2 early in this floor set. Additionally, I like to use alterations for 192 and 193. While it's definitely a gamble to spawn a room full of mimics because of how tough they are without steal, I find it to be worth the risk because it can reduce the number of patrols roaming around and make these early floors much quicker if you're lucky enough to get Mandragoras. I usually avoid using any resolutions I have on these early floors because only mummies and courses are considered undead. However, because the courses are stunnable, it's possible to use Heavenly Judge to clear out a few of them quickly. Without steal, this can be extremely dangerous because of their ability to gap close, and I would only suggest doing so if there's a large number of courses and you have some sort of obstruction or a lot of space to place between you and the course to prevent it from immediately leaping at you once the stun wears off. When it comes to enchantments, no items floors still often require a serenity. Traps are very doable without sustaining pots, but mummies become extremely difficult. Gloom or HP down can also make mummies quite dangerous, so you may have to use serenity in those situations as well, especially if both enchantments appear together. However, as usual, you ideally want to try to preserve serenities, especially for later floors when you'll be using any resolutions and rages that you have. You'll need serenity to get rid of no items or knockback disabled as necessary. Onyx dragons appear in the early to mid 190s, and are different from all the other dragons in Palace because they aggro based on proximity. They'll open with a frontal cone sight mechanic called Evil Eye, then follow that up with a telegraph frontal cone AoE. However, they don't double attack, meaning that with enough room to kite, they can be fought without steel. Bicephalus are the non-patrolling brothers of the Iron Courses. They don't have a gap closer, but do use a double attack, meaning that they cannot be fought without steel. After double attacking, they'll use a telegraphed AoE. They're straightforward to fight if you do happen to have steel running. Wraiths are one of the few options available on the middle and late floors that can be fought without steel. Similar to Wraiths on earlier floors, they'll cast a massive AoE called Scream, but this time they follow that up with another telegraphed AoE. They also cast random AoEs when not aggroed, so be aware when fighting other enemies near Wraiths. Additionally, they're one of the few enemies that can be stunned with Heavenly Judge, so they're the best enemy to target when using a Resolution Pomander. Vashans are the patrols for the middle floors in this set, and luckily, they can be fought without steel. They have ranged auto attacks and cast a frontal cone AoE called Level 5 Death. It does exactly what it sounds like it does, so don't get hit by it. They cast this very frequently, usually every 2 ranged attacks, so always pay attention when fighting them, and move through them whenever they begin to cast death. Because they use ranged auto attacks, they don't miss and output a very consistent amount of damage. If you don't have steel active, you'll have to Vercure frequently while fighting them. Also, it's very important to note that Vashans are not considered undead, meaning that Heavenly Judge on them is virtually useless. Avoid them completely when using a Resolution Pomander. Knights are the other double attacker that start appearing in the mid-190s. As with the other double attackers, you'll need steel to fight them. After opening with their double attack, they'll cast a massive donut AoE. Be sure to stay close to them. Additionally, after 45 seconds, they'll buff their damage. Definitely try to kite and avoid attacks as much as possible during that time. When fighting a knight, be sure there aren't any wraiths around. If the knight casts its donut AoE, and a wraith uses its random AoE at the same time, it can fill up the space in the donut and leave you with nowhere to go. These floors are probably the easiest section of this set. The Iron Course patrols are replaced with an alternative that can be fought without steel, Vashans. Additionally, Wraiths and Dragons replace traps and mummies, so there are still plenty of other options to fight without steel as well. However, being proximity aggro means that Bicephalus and Knights can get in the way and force you to fight them occasionally. If this happens, you'll have to use steel, or worst case scenario, a resolution and pray that you don't miss or get critted. Saving steel for the late 190s is extremely important because the number of options that can be fought there without it decreases significantly, but sometimes RNG gives you no other option but to use it at this point. Also, based on time, at some point during these mid or late floors, you may be able to keep strength and steel buffs running for the remainder of the run. For example, if there's less than 25 minutes left on the clock, and you still have 3 strengths, use one immediately, because the duration of the 3 strengths will fully cover the remaining time. If you're stocked up on safety and sight, be sure to start using them. If you have 3 of each, that means you can use one or the other on the last 6 floors, and not have to worry about traps for the rest of the run. I generally use safety on these floors, and save sight to use on the later floors where I'm more likely to be using Resolution or Rage so that I can clear a path to the exit. Resolution isn't a bad option at this point, but keep in mind that Vashans are not considered undead. You'll have to avoid them completely during the transformation, or be forced to exit it early and not get the full value out of it. Because of this, I usually try to save my resolutions for the late 190s, but if you still have rages for those floors, or you're out of other options, using them at this point can still be a good idea. The strategy for enchantments isn't much different from the early floors. No items is still usually a no-go, while Gloom and HP down makes fighting even the easier enemies without steel extremely difficult. If time is an issue, you might even have to consider using Serenity if hit with an abilities disabled, damage down, or blinded floor. However, as mentioned before, you really want to have Serenities available later for floors where you're planning to Resolution or Rage, just in case you get unlucky with the enchantments. Like many of the other enemies earlier in this set, Gorbans are double attackers. Unlike those enemies though, they don't have any other mechanics. They'll just keep hitting you with autos and the double attack. Because of this, they hurt, but they're still fine to fight as long as you have steel up. Additionally, they're one of the few enemies that can be stunned by Heavenly Judge, making them a great target when transformed, even if you don't have steel running. Of all the double attacking enemies on this floor set, Keepers hit the hardest. Not only do their attacks do the most damage, but just like Gourmands, they don't do any cast or other mechanics. They'll just keep hitting you hard over and over again with their autos and double attack. The good news is that because they're sound aggro, they can be avoided fairly easily and can still be fought with steel if necessary. Because Fashans and Dragons start to disappear once you reach these floors, the only option left that can be fought without steel are Wraiths. To make things worse, these floors spawn even more enemies than usual, and it's not uncommon to see conga lines of Keeper patrols, which can make it challenging to find any room to fight. Additionally, these last 3 floors have an extremely high rate of enchantments, so expect to have to burn Serenities on at least 1 or 2 of them. Hopefully you have Steel, Resolution, Flight, or Rage available to use at this point. Flight can be extremely helpful for giving you some space to work with on these last 3 floors because of the higher than normal number of spawns. Steel is necessary for fighting all non-Wraith enemies, which you'll most certainly be forced to do unless you have Resolution or Rage available to gather quick kills. If using a Resolution, focus on Wraiths and Gourmands, since those are the 2 enemies on these floors that are stunnable. They shouldn't even be able to get an auto attack off if you position your cast correctly. This is especially important if you don't have Steel running. Knights are dangerous because they can kill you if they crit their initial auto and double attack, but if you survive that, you should be able to finish them off while they cast their Donut AoE. On the other hand, absolutely avoid using Heavenly Judge on Keepers if you don't have Steel. Once again, if using Resolution or Rage, using Sight at this point can be very helpful for directing your path. Serenities are extremely important to ensure that you're able to use Resolution and Rage. There's no worse feeling than having a Rage ready to go for the last floor, but being hit with no items or knockback disabled, and having no way to clear the debuff. This is the final stretch, so if you see any opportunities where your remaining Pomanders can give you even the smallest advantage, be sure to use them. You don't get anything out of keeping them around after this set. There's no boss on floor 200, so you can take a bit more time to clear the first 9 floors than normal. However, you do have to run some distance and activate either the glass pumpkin or firecrest on the pedestal at the end of the floor, so make sure that you leave yourself at least a minute to do so. The last thing you want is to make it to floor 200, but run out of time before hitting the buzzer. The duty will fail, just as it would have if you timed out on any other floor, and you'll miss out on the Necromancer title and score bonus. If you do make it in time, congratulations on achieving one of the hardest accomplishments in Final Fantasy XIV, and becoming a Necromancer. Take a few obligatory bench screenshots, leave the area to get your final score, and equip your beautiful new title. But now that you're a Necromancer, what should you do now? If you enjoyed it, you can try the challenge with a different job, do another run with the same job but focus on getting a higher score, or move on to soloing Heaven on High and becoming a lone hero if you haven't already done so. But now that you've reached your goal, if you never want to spend another moment in Deep Dungeon, you don't have to. Regardless of what you decide, if you're interested in seeing your score on the leaderboards, keep in mind that they update nightly, so don't expect to see yourself on there immediately. Check back again the next day. I hope this guide has been helpful and that you're able to become a Necromancer without too much difficulty. However, if you're struggling to get the clear, don't get discouraged. It'll take time and practice. If you find yourself getting frustrated, don't be afraid to take a break. It's very easy to get burned out, and I had to take plenty of time off between attempts when I was going for my first clear. If you aren't having fun, don't feel the need to keep trying until you get the clear. Soloing Palace certainly isn't something that everyone will enjoy, and if it just feels like torture to you, don't force yourself to keep going. Once again, feel free to reach out to me on Discord, or stop by one of my Twitch streams if you have any questions, need advice, or want to talk about your own attempts at soloing Palace. Finally, there's a few people I would like to thank for their help with this video. Thank you to Maygi, Noriben, and Toto, who all gave me permission to use their content. A special thanks to Chiela as well, who served as translator for my conversation with Noriben regarding this guide. Shout out to my friend Kate for creating the amazing emotes that you saw in the floor-by-floor walkthrough. Most of all, thank you to Angelus for reviewing and providing suggestions regarding the content in this video, and for allowing me to use some of his own content to help showcase the Deep Dungeon community. Without his streams and Meiji's guide, not only would this video not exist, but I never would have attempted soloing Palace myself in the first place. Last of all, thanks to all of you for watching, and best of luck becoming a Necromancer.